Good morning. Welcome to this new edition of the Brazil Economic Conference. I would like at the start to thank White & Case for hosting us and to thank Evelyn Balaciano, who's present here today for this invitation. And it's my great honor to introduce to you Ambassador Clifford Sobel. Clifford Sobel is an American diplomat, business executive, and investor. He served as the U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of the Netherlands from 2001 to 2005, and subsequently as ambassador to Brazil from 2006 to 2009. And thank you very much for that, Ambassador. In the private sector, he's a founding partner and managing partner of Valor Capital Group, a growth, equity, and venture capital firm focusing on cross-border U.S., Brazil, Latin American opportunities. Ambassador Sobel has held advisory roles on various boards and commissions, including the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, the Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board, and boards related to military commands in Europe and the Americas. He earned his degree from New York University and was awarded an honorary doctorate of law by Kean University. Before I call for Ambassador Sobel, I wanted to note that Will Landers was supposed to be here and introduce Ambassador, but he has some unfortunate illness in the family, so he could not be with us here today. Ambassador Sobel, please.
Good morning, everybody. Bom dia. I usually do not do what I'm doing right now. My standard answer is no, but because I was in Brazil last week and there were so many occurrences and conversations I had, and I truly do believe there can be a fork in the road, a very positive fork in the road for our relations. I decided to speak this morning. The fact that I live around the corner didn't hurt. The fact that my wife thinks she's a Brazilian and she's not does not hurt. I went down to Brazil last week because her foundation, America's Amigas Pink October, had a very successful event. And I'm really glad I went down. I usually go down every other month. In this case, I'm going down 3 months in a row. We still live in the Jardins, and we love Brazil. And to see what was happening in front of our eyes was incredibly disturbing, as I'm sure it was to all of you. We all know it's a 9-hour flight back. I couldn't sleep, so you're going to be stuck listening to prepared remarks because I want to make sure I don't make a mistake. I want to thank the Chamber for everything that you do. There's probably no more important organization in our two countries that bring our countries together, and for that we are all appreciative. I was told that Minister Haddad was invited, but as probably all of you know, he's in Brasilia this week dealing with the repercussions of the failed MP to restore tax revenue. The conversations I had, which I'll get into in a minute, really focused on the need for fiscal austerity and revenues to be able to balance a budget that sorely needs to be balanced. But I'll get into that in a few minutes. As I said, my remarks today are significantly different than they will be or would have been only a few weeks ago. I'll quote Minister Haddad in July when the American actions, he said, did not have any economic reality. He called the tariffs and the Magnitsky Act an aggression, it's a pretty strong word, and said they would challenge the United States in courts and elsewhere. In September, after the brief encounter at the UN, he said the conflict, crazy word, was being overcome. Today, I really do think we are on a path of reconciliation. Foreign Minister Vieira will meet with Secretary Rubio in Washington. I think it'll be this Thursday. It may have already been published. Secretary Rubio is absolutely the best interlocutor for Brazil. Given the fact that this is a political issue more than anything else, and the fact that Rubio is also our national security advisor, puts him at the right place at the right time. But I'll also, in a minute, explain why he's also an excellent interlocutor, given his background. The meeting in Washington will be focused more on process, I'm told, not necessarily at this stage on any resolutions. However, the lines are drawn and there is a basic understanding of what the key issues are. The focus this Thursday will also talk about censorship, which is an American concern, a free press, and Brazil's concern, which is really deep, of sanctions on Brazilian banks due to the Majeski Act is a real concern to Brazil and could spiral out of control. Lula said it perfectly last week. It's always good for an ambassador, a former ambassador, to quote other people. That way you can't quote me. But he said, this only is the first step in restoring a working relationship and resuming cooperation. Let me assure you, all this did not happen because of a chance encounter, which I believe was not a chance encounter at the UN for 36 seconds. A lot of credit does go to CNI and institutions like the Brazil-American Chamber. The private sector was enormously helpful. The countless meetings on the Hill in government, including the White House, Embraer, Suzano, Caterpillar, GE, JP Morgan, all actively involved. And for those that may have missed the small article, JBS met with the president in the White House for an extensive amount of time. No one of these items turned the tide, but they all showed a collaborative effort that showed effects even before this coming week. All of you know that the 40% of the exports of Brazil have been either reduced or eliminated in the tariff debate. The U.S. also has a very interesting interlocutor here that is not really understood. When a country does not have an ambassador, a DCM, the deputy, becomes what is called a charge. And usually they're well respected, but they don't have the same access, the same ability here in Brazil and in Washington to really move the needle. In this case, the charge is Gabriel Escobar, who I've had extensive conversations with. He is not the former DCM. He's been an envoy in many geopolitical issues all over the world. He has been a DCM elsewhere and was on a fast track for an ambassadorship. I'm sure if he survives Brazil, he'll have his ambassadorship quickly. But he's intimately involved, and he's the one who's really on the front line reporting back to Washington what's happening, and I think he's doing a great job. President Lula's team is also committed to building an era of cooperation and partnership. Foreign Minister Vieira was the former Brazil ambassador to the United States. He knows the United States. By the way, your ambassador today, Maria Luisa, is excellent. I think is one of the great ambassadors in the world, formerly at the UN. Vice President Aklamine has been in the papers repeatedly trying to move the agenda forward. I'm not sure, I'm told he won't be in Washington because this is a process meeting, not a negotiating meeting, but anything can change, and for all I know, he will be in Washington. And of course, Minister Haddad was going to be part of the team. He's a little bit distracted with budget issues. I mentioned earlier Secretary Rubio is perhaps best positioned to be the interlocutor. This is a political issue. We all know that the balance of trade was significantly in the United States' favor. But there were other issues that we all know we don't need to enumerate. But what's you all know about Secretary Rubio, despite the skepticism in Brasilia, is his Cuban roots. He is focused on Latin America. And he did something quite extraordinary. When he got nominated, he picked a deputy. Now, you would think with his expertise and knowledge, he would pick somebody that would know Middle East affairs, European affairs, Asian affairs. He didn't. He picked Chris Landau, our former ambassador to Mexico, to be his deputy. So it is very rare, if not unique, to have the top two at the State Department focused on Western Hemisphere affairs. He appointed him because he knew he would be distracted globally, and he wanted somebody who put Western Hemisphere first. And Chris met with many groups that came from Brazil and is intimately involved in this whole process. With all this being said, in my opinion, what is going to be the most important factor in developing a personal relationship is the personal relationship between the two presidents. And I had the great opportunity of seeing how important that was when I served not only for President Bush and took Lula to Camp David, the first Latin American leader ever to be hosted at Camp David. And after that, I was asked to stay for Obama. I was the only Republican ambassador asked to stay because of the importance of the region. They didn't want to start with a new ambassador, 6 months, and we were able to get Lula in the White House quickly with Obama, within 6 months of Obama's election. Lula is perhaps one of the best diplomats I've ever seen. From the very first time I introduced him on the UN and used my not-so-good Portuguese, which, by the way, I learned a lesson. I don't talk in Portuguese. I don't try to talk in Portuguese. But Lula came up to me afterwards, gave me a drink. I needed the drink. But he gave me one of his famous bear hugs, which he did again, actually, after Camp David. He knows how to communicate with people. Today, Lula has... I have a note here I'll go back to. Today, Lula has, believe it or not, President Trump's phone number. And I'm told he has a question he's going to ask President Trump this week. Let me assure you, there are not too many world leaders that have President Trump's personal phone number. Be interesting to see if he does make that call. I made a note here of another interesting example of Lula's diplomacy, which I'll share with you. When President Bush came to Sao Paulo, he was, of course, hosted by a lunch. And I guess Lula knew that the president liked beef. And he had he had a steak, and then ordered a second portion. I was surprised. And then Lula said, "Did you like your steak?" And Bush said, "I loved it." And Lula said, "That's really too bad." So, of course, Bush said, "Why is it bad?" He says, "Because you can't get that beef in the United States. You won't allow it into the country." I swear, a month later, we began a pilot program from Santa Catarina importing Brazilian beef. Lula's idea, and it worked. Quite remarkable. Anyway, I was in Brazil last week and met many leading banks, corporations, government leaders. Our primary offices are in Faria Lima, in fact, next to the BTG building. And we discussed a lot of topics. I'll digress in a topic that concerns all of you and concerns everybody in Brazil, and that is high interest rates. I was able to have an old friend of mine, Enrique Morales, up to our office last week, and I asked him to make some remarks to our staff that works there. And he started, I'm almost thinking he's Italian now, he uses his hands a lot. He started talking about the role of the central bank, and he used the word productivity. He said, since Brazil is having problems, and has always had problems increasing productivity, the Reform Acts helped a little bit. But without an increase in productivity, you have to have a balance between fiscal spending and interest rates. I'm talking with my hands too. And he said what the central bank has done incredibly well with Roberto Campos and Gabrielle has been to keep that balance in place. Gabrielle also, and this is very important, understands the sensitivity that President Trump has to defend the dollar as the global reserve currency in the world. Before the president was even elected, right here in New York, he gave a speech to the Economic Club of New York, and he highlighted the fact that perhaps we went too far with the sanctions, but that ultimately defending the dollar was, in his mind, one of the most important roles he would have as President of the United States. Because Valor is so involved in digital finance, I got involved with Gabrielle and asked him, will he continue to support all of the democratization of digital finance that Roberto Campos led the effort on. Roberto Campos won Best Central Banker in the World 3 years in a row. And only in the last 2 weeks, Gabrielle has been not nominated, but recognized as one of the 100 most important financial figures in the world. It is important to note that the United States is now back at the table, which we haven't been, focused on digital finance, blockchain, stablecoin, and crypto. The Genius Act that put us back at the table was actually written by Senator Haggerty's office, a good friend. He'll be at our conference actually in November at the Milken Center talking about the Genius Act in Washington. We, Valor, just published a paper with McKinsey called the Brazil Stack, and it outlines Brazil's leadership in the world in digital finance. Brazil, for those of you that are not aware, is the global laboratory in the world for instant payments, obviously through PIX, open banking via open finance, and using blockchain will make tokenization a reality, perhaps in Brazil before any other country. Some of the great global corporate leaders in digital finance have come out of Brazil. Nubank, Stone. When Stone went public, it was the largest fintech ever to go public on the NASDAQ. Now CloudWalk is soon going to be behind that. The leadership of this area in Brazil is perhaps based upon the close relationship between CVM, your SEC, and the central bank. In the United States, there are 16 agencies that touch the areas that the CVM are responsible for, plus state agencies. It's almost impossible to move things along quickly, and that is not the case in Brazil, and that is why Brazil, in many ways, is leading the world in this critical arena. Almost as important sometimes, I think, as AI. International settlements will change, the SWIFT system will clearly change, and Brazil will be a hub for it. Today, Brazil has proven the pundits wrong once again. I can't tell you how many times we read that the economy is going down, revenue is off, FDI is off, and it's a story that starts negative, and all of a sudden, by the end of the year, the numbers come in differently. Currently, we're expecting a 2.5% rise in GDP, almost double what was projected earlier this year. FDI is still resilient, and what's remarkable, despite the tariffs, agriculture in Brazil has been so resilient that the increase in exports has been quite dramatic, despite what the pundits had thought. The strong fintech community I referred to about 10 minutes ago, has now fostered 1,500 new startups. Brazil has its challenges, there is no question. Inflation, which we've discussed, is still outside the acceptable range of 4.5. Today it's running at 5.13. Brazil has to start showing fiscal restraint, and without that, interest rates will not come down. And in an election year, how difficult will it be for this administration to rein in spending? I think it'll be very difficult. Ultimately, increasing productivity is crucial. Gabrielle mentioned that, and Enrique Morales mentioned it, and it's something that has to be focused on going forward. Next year, growth is only projected to be 1.6. Perhaps the meetings in Washington will change that. Ultimately, what I want to leave you with is the personal relationship that has started to develop between President Lula and President Trump could enter into a new era of friendship, cooperation, and prosperity for all of the Americas. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Ambassador Sobol. That was a marvelous introduction and a great call for all of us to focus on the challenges that are ahead. I'm sure
I'll say one more thing, talk a little bit louder. We all always focus on today and tomorrow. Very rarely do we focus on the past. And I actually enjoy thinking about my experiences in Brazil and how extraordinary, and I'm not taking sides in this election, believe me. It's not about an upcoming election. But the diplomatic skills of Lula, if he uses them with a man like President Trump, could really pay dividends. And I actually enjoyed thinking about some of the experience. One last, I can tell you 100 stories, but I'll never forget Marco Aurelio Garcia and Celso Amorim being apoplectic at Camp David because President Bush decided to take President Lula on a golf cart with only a translator. So they had no idea what was being said. I was the American ambassador. I had no idea what was being said. But at Camp David that night, we had dinner together, and it was an extraordinary trip. So Lula has incredible diplomatic skills.
Thank you again. Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce Evelyn Balaciano. She's our host today, so please welcome Evelyn.
Bom dia a todos. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for being here today. It is White & Case's absolute honor to once again host this important forum for discussion of the Brazilian-U.S. relations and the Brazilian economy. As a Brazilian expat living in New York since 2011 and representing Brazilian sponsors and lenders on their most complex energy and infrastructure transactions, opening this event today is a special opportunity and a true pleasure. And for those of you who may not know White & Case, our firm was born here in New York in 1901, but its international outlook became evident early on in its history. We opened our first international office in 1926, only 25 years later, in Paris. And in the 80s, we began our strategic transformation into a global law firm, seeing the opportunities that globalization was bringing to our clients. So today we have 44 offices across the globe. And on-the-ground experience, cross-border integration, and the depth of our lawyers set us apart from all other firms and help our clients navigate with confidence across multiple markets. So our history in Brazil is also one that goes back many years. We were among the first international law firms to have boots on the ground in Brazil, establishing our São Paulo office in 1997. And in the span of the last 28 years, we have seen Brazil consolidate its democracy. The re-election of President Fernando Henrique, the first 2 terms of President Lula, the election and impeachment of the first Brazilian woman president. But in this process, we have also seen various shifts in Brazil's economic and fiscal policies, from IMF rescue packages and economic reforms in the 90s, through the GDP growth of the early 2000s and the current economic deceleration and the need for more productivity, as Ambassador Silva just mentioned. But what has not changed in this 28 years has been our confidence in Brazil. Our experience operating in Latin America for so long has shown that political and economic turbulence are recurring and part of doing business in the region. But they also often bring significant opportunities. and because we also have seen Brazil consolidate its position as one of the world's largest emerging markets over the last few decades. This has been reflected in our work, having advised on the New York and international aspects of some of the largest and most high-profile cross-border debt and equity capital market offerings, corporate structured and project financings, and acquisition and joint venture transactions in Brazil. And we have also supported clients with the most important cross-border debt restructuring and disputes. So taking opportunity, seeing opportunities in all the different phases of that Brazil has had. So it's with optimism that we host today's event. We won't presume that our panelists have come with crystal balls, so we may need to wait until 2026 to more conclusively predict Brazil's economic and fiscal policies. But I do look forward to hearing from our panelists regarding Brazil's economic prospects and where the opportunities will lie for those of us who continue to believe in Brazil. Thank you.
Well, good morning again, and thank you for being here. We are delighted to be able to host this panel focusing on the macroeconomic and strategic investments in Brazil. And we really have a wonderful panel. If you allow me, I will also read my remarks, and they will be very brief. As we gather for another overview, the Brazilian economy continues to stumble forward. And in the current global context, that is not a bad outcome. Brazilian exporters have succeeded in offsetting lost revenue from the U.S. market. And as Ambassador Sobel just told us, it seems like we are off to a good resolution. The trade-off has been a greater reliance on China as a destination, but certainly the situation could have been worse. The unemployment rate remains unexpectedly low, and real income gains continue to support household consumption. Earlier forecasts of a mild recession have given way to expectations of continued low growth, with a steady investment rate near 17% of GDP. While this is disappointing, especially given Brazil's chronic productivity challenges, such tepid investment has become the country's steady-state norm. There are some positives, most notably the sweeping consumption tax reform, a potential catalyst for greater efficiency. There is also hope for further improvements in the income tax if the tax reform now being debated in the Senate is enacted. At present, however, the significance of this reform is decidedly political. With the trials and sentencing of Bolsonaro and his circle behind us, and following the tumult over Trump's accusations and tariffs, the focus is the elections in 2026. For the Lula administration, a crushing defeat of the proposed tax measures for the 2026 budget, which the ambassador reminded us, followed the near-unanimous approval of the income tax bill in the lower house. The message could not have been clearer. The opportunistic center of the governing coalition, once open to negotiation, is now firmly in opposition and unwilling to endorse spending measures that might enhance Lula's prospects in 2026. For markets, the path ahead seems set. The economy is edging closer to a monumental fiscal cliff, with unsustainably rising public debt and a complex, untenable fiscal framework. The nominal fiscal deficit stands at 8% of GDP and could widen further in 2026, particularly given already elevated real interest rates. Nonetheless, an immediate policy shift looks unlikely. a reality that has been clear since the crisis of December 2024. In the months ahead, battles over control of additional election year spending will intensify at every level of government, with little else likely to be accomplished. The best hope is that the next administration, taking office in 2027, will have both a mandate and a determination to undertake structural fiscal reforms, shifting the country's mindset from crisis management to building a foundation for productivity-enhancing long-term investment. It's a long road to 2027. To help us understand what lies ahead, we are fortunate to have with us a distinguished panel of experts. I would like to thank them for being here today. Our panel will unfold in two parts. First, each of our speakers will present their main remarks in about 10 minutes each. After that, my co-moderator, Drauzio Giacomelli, will lead a more focused Q&A with the panelists before opening the floor to your questions. So let's proceed, and I would like to introduce Robert Sesemski from Barclays Cap.
Thank you, Paulo and Drauzio, for the invite. It's always a pleasure to be here with the Brazilian Chamber. I prepared a couple of remarks here, but they will basically repeat some of the points that Ambassador Sobel and Paulo made just now. Unfortunately, as a skeptical economist, I tend to lean a little more on the glass half empty side of things, but I'm hoping that my colleagues here in the panel will help get us into to get the glass a little bit fuller as the panel progresses. But maybe starting with the conclusion, I think the point is that I do not see the conditions in Brazil in the foreseeable future for us to return to interest rates being in the single-digit territory, mainly because of the fiscal story, basically, that we have there. We could get into single-digit rates, but they wouldn't stay there. Like, I don't see the structural conditions for us to unlock that. Essentially because of points that have been mentioned here before. The fiscal imbalances are quite significant in Brazil, and at present we don't see willingness or leadership required to turn things around. We're basically in a third year of nominal deficits that hover between 8 and 9% of GDP, which is extremely large. Yes, the interest burden adds to that, but I think the fact of the matter, as it was mentioned before, the pace of growth in public spending in Brazil is very large. Like, just in the past 3 years, public spending has grown 14% in real terms. So above inflation, it's 14% more since the end of 2022 that Brazil is spending. And the result of that is that gross debt continues to grow unchecked. Basically, public debt in Brazil is on a path to reach 80% in the next 12 months or so. This is among the highest debt loads in the emerging market space for a country that notoriously has very high real interest rates. So servicing that debt gets increasingly more concerning. And as we saw last November, December, at times those concerns do take the forefront of market participants there. And we are in the process of seeing, as I said, like, public spending is up 14% in the past 3 years. That to GDP is up almost 8 percentage points of GDP in that period as well. And what this means is that basically the over-leveraging of the economy that we see as a result of increasing indebtedness and nominal deficits that continue to escalate is that in the short term, the economy does grow faster. We see stronger domestic demand, and that pushes GDP growth above its potential. Also because potential growth in Brazil, unfortunately, is relatively quite low. So in part precisely because of the deficit we have in productivity growth, the fact that capital investments are repressed because of high real interest rates. There's this negative feedback loop that we see between high real interest rates, low growth, and fiscal expansion. And we are currently stuck in one of those where the economy is growing above potential, a potential growth that is low, which puts pressure on an already tight labor market. Wages grow well above productivity gains. Wages growing should be a good thing, and it typically is a good thing, but not if it's not accompanied by gains in productivity, because sooner or later that becomes inflationary pressures, which are present in Brazil. So in this environment of growth exceeding potential because of the fiscal largesse, we see inflation not converging to its target. We see the current account deficit widening because domestic demand is stronger than it should be otherwise, to the point that external resources are used to meet those needs. And what this all means is that interest rates are set to remain too high for too long, and in that process, high risk premium sets in, right? Because so that comes on top of. So you have a structural situation where interest rates are higher than they would be otherwise if the fiscal was better balanced, and risk premium comes on top of that component, exacerbating the pressures on fiscal accounts. So we basically, at present, we see all the expected symptoms of an economy overheating, an economy with a low growth profile overheating, and fiscal accounts on a path that cannot be sustained indefinitely. So how do we turn things around, right? Like, and why am I, let's say, a little bit skeptical about things? I think to stabilize debt that has been growing on for over a decade now, an adjustment of about 2 percentage points of GDP would be needed. That means 250 billion reais in the budget that needs to be found. And this is a monumental task. 250 billion reais is significant. If you follow the day-to-day in Brazil and the fiscal headlines and the bumps we had, Provisional Measure 1303 that just failed last week, like that was meant to bring 30 billion. It would be important. It's a step, but again, just to put things in perspective, over 250 billion are needed if we want to stabilize debt. And I don't see that happening this year, next year, possibly not even during the next presidential mandate, whoever wins. In part because the Brazilian budget is extremely rigid, as we always discuss time and again. There are only 8% of it that is discretionary in nature. That doesn't even mean that the 8% can be freely allocated, because there's rigidity within that portion as well. And the other 92% are mandatory, which means that for the government to find the resource that it needs to stabilize debt, like unpopular choices need to be made. Probably a combination of higher taxes with spending cuts, followed by several reforms that allow for a slower pace of growth in spending, that growth that I mentioned that is at 14% in the past 3 years. But I do not detect a high level of commitment from Congress at this point on that front. So the president, again, whoever that is, would have to be willing to lead that effort. In the next 12 months, as Paulo was saying, like I do expect a pickup in volatility ahead of elections. I think it's important to keep in mind that every incumbent running for re-election in Brazil since the mid-1990s, so it's Fernando Henrique Cardoso, it's Lula, it's Dilma, it's Bolsonaro, all incumbents who were trying to get re-elected, they were able to engineer a 20 percentage point boost to their approval rates in the year of elections. And there's a reason for that. It's not because they were fiscally conservative. It's not because clearly the electoral environment does not make it likely that those unpopular choices will be made or even presented at that point. So if the past serves as a guide, next year's elections could be quite contested. And to be fair, that's what we're seeing. Very early polls, like 1 year ahead, like a lot will change. But that kind of fiscal vulnerability that will not be tackled on for a year, that requires structural changes that are unlikely to be fully implemented even in the following 4 years, are things that concern me. But the amount of complacency with these challenges and whether markets sell off or not also depend on the evolution of the external environment. We cannot ignore the world around us. as we've seen time and again. So the easier financial conditions are worldwide, the more complacent or the less concerned investors are about those immediate facts. But sooner or later, they will matter again, because at a structural level, as I was saying, it's like that prevents us from having real interest rates at lower levels that allow for capital investments, that allow for higher potential growth in Brazil, that does not put pressure on inflation, and so on and so forth. Now, if I'm wrong, and we do hear positive ideas on the fiscal front over next year, it is possible that markets could get excited and bring forward the expectation of stabilization in fiscal accounts even before we see that effectively happening, right? And we saw that happen, to be fair, at the end of 2016 when the spending cap was approved. And interest rates started declining almost right away, even though the objective situation was still quite bad. So the beauty of elections and potential changes that we see is credibility shocks or changes in expectations that allow for a better environment for the delivery of what will be challenging no matter what. But so there is hope that even if the turning the situation around of the 250 billion reais is unlikely to happen as fast as we'd like, credible plans that could be presented could bear fruit relatively quickly. That would lower the bar for the adjustment, actually. You get endogeneity in things, like things started happening faster and perhaps more easily. But again, it's a task for many, many years to come. Just to conclude, I think in terms of growth in Brazil, we expect the economy to continue to slow down this year, mainly because of how tight monetary policy has been. So growth coming from 3.4% last year to 2.1% this year to 1.7% next year in 2026. Which is more or less closer to what I see as a potential growth in Brazil, something between 1.7 and 2%. We're coming from 3 years of much faster growth in 2022, 3 and 4, well above 3%, which explains the inflationary pressures we see and so on. So I expect some deceleration to happen. If I'm wrong about next year, I think Brazil will grow more than 1.7% precisely because of some electoral initiatives. And I also because the labor market continues to provide an important source of support for consumption. So and the flip side of that is resilience to inflation, right? So all things being told, I see limited space for the central bank to start normalizing rates with inflation continuing to be away from the 3% target. I have inflation this year at 4.6%. IPC inflation, which is being helped by the stronger BRL, by food prices because of very favorable crops, but not by services because of the tight labor market, and 4.2% next year for inflation. So I expect the central bank to start cutting rates starting in March, but for a relatively shallow cycle of only 225 bips, so basically bringing the Selic from 15% to 12.75 by September of next year. The real questions for me is like about the structural changes that could enable rates coming back to the single digit territory, as I said. And but I'll stop here before I depress anyone more. But I think those are my opening remarks.
Thank you, Roberto. That was a sobering assessment, but I think. Not out of line with most of the macroeconomic forecasters, and it is indeed a tragedy for the Brazilian people that an economy that grows at 2% is growing above potential, and that is a real challenge in the years ahead to shift that. But we are very fortunate to have with us today Vinicius to give us another view on what may be looking for the Brazilian economy in the months ahead. Please.
Thanks. So, in general, I think that the diagnosis that Roberto gave us is pretty, clear that that's the dynamics of the Brazilian economy. I'll just add one thing, that while the pandemic was, from a human aspect, terrible, the environment of low interest rates with a fiscal expansion and high inflation that came after that cleaned up balance sheets generally from the private sector at the expense of the public sector. And when we look at the mistakes we economists did for growth in the last 4 or 5 years, I think is that we underestimated how healthy those balance sheets were. It wasn't so much about, and we usually blame this 1 year in agriculture, the other year on fiscal, and that part of this is obviously true. But the underlying factor on this was that the private sector was healthy and has been healthy at least up to the end of last year. What I would say is that what we have in a different perspective here is that even though we reached this point where the economy is growing more than expected and has grown more than expected for a while, the repercussions of this were clear on the inflation side and on the external side. Roberto mentioned our external deficit is at 3.5% of GDP, and we have to remember that even though this is not very high for Brazilian standards, though it's high, we live in a world now of positive real interest rates across the globe, and there's not much capital going to Brazil as it was in the 2010s. Brazil was also back then an IG country. We had the investment grade, and therefore it's one of the reasons why this is the year where you had the largest hole in Brazil's financial flows ever recorded. Right, so it is a challenging situation. What I would deviate a little bit from the Roberto's view is what comes ahead. Because if you look at private sector balance sheets, companies, non-financial companies' balance sheets, those have deteriorated significantly. And the reason is pretty straightforward. If you look at their costs, interest rates are above inflation. Right? It's more interest rates that then can pass on to the consumers. Wages, labor costs are growing above inflation. That's more than what they are passing on to consumers, right? And taxes are growing more than inflation as well. So the costs that the private sector is bearing at this point, they are much larger than the costs and that the balance sheet that they had in the past could handle. And therefore, we think that these imbalances are going to deliver a more pronounced economic deceleration. We've been actually on the more optimistic side on economic growth for the better part of the last 2 years. And for next year, we have only 1.2 growth, even with the fiscal spending that some of us expect. And for that reason, we are also expecting inflation to come down faster, and that you have this, BCB cutting interest rates faster and deeper than what the market is expecting. We are expecting the Selic rate at 10.75 by the end of next year. And obviously, and I think that's where I go back to Roberto's point, which is that to have much lower interest rates than that, and by the way, around 11% nominal rate with maybe 4% inflation, it's still very high real interest rates. To have something below that, you do need the reforms that Roberto mentioned. What I would say is that the challenge is still there, and it's a very hard challenge for anyone to solve. What I think that this administration is missing at this point is the following. They brought the fiscal deficit from 2.3 that they made themselves in 2023, by the way, but they brought this to balance at some point this year. And you would expect this to say, well, fiscal deficit is lower. The primary deficit, at least, is lower. And therefore, this means that Brazil is in a better fiscal position. But when you look at market prices, they don't reflect that. I mean, they now reflect more of that because of the dollar, because of the global environment, but they don't reflect that when you look at across our peers in Latin America and the rest of the world. What's happening is that there's what we call a dissonance between this administration strategy and what the market is expecting. And I'll give you one example of a very recent story. In 2016, Brazil approved the spending cap, the famous spending cap. 2016, we had a fiscal deficit. 2017, we had a fiscal deficit. In 2018, we had a fiscal deficit. And in 2019, also a deficit. 2020, then it's the pandemic. It's another story. But when you look at the market prices, they reflect the deficit spending cap, and obviously more things that came after this, a better fiscal environment. Why is that? Why is the market dealing with this in different aspects when you look at the primary fiscal numbers specifically? The point I would make here is the following. Brazil's problems are structural. They're not cyclical. And the way that this is being treated right now is a cyclical problem where you need to raise revenues for some time, and that this is going to solve the problem. It won't solve the problem. And I think Roberto mentioned a few point, but Brazil has a high debt, has high interest rates, has low growth, has a rigid budget, and has a very high already tax burden. So it's almost like a company that is very indebted, and there's no way that they can raise revenues. There's no way that they can cut expenditures, and so it's a very difficult situation, right? And therefore, what you need are reforms that tackle structurally spending, reforms that tackle structurally the high interest rates, and reforms that tackle structurally Brazil's low growth, low productivity environment. And that's why you see this difference between the treatment given to Brazil in 2016 and now. Because in 2016, you started not only with the spending cap, but then came a labor reform, what we call it's a series of measures, a financial reform, and so on. And all of this was aiming to raise Brazil's potential GDP growth. And I think it has grown not as much as we'd like, but it's better than what we expected in the past. You look at the labor market numbers. If the unemployment rate in Brazil were at this point in 2015, 2014, you would have expected to see services inflation close to 10% in Brazil. It's running at 6%. It's around 6% at the margin, right? So one of the reasons is because of those reforms were implemented. If you look at the financial markets in Brazil, and I'm not saying because we work at the financial markets, but it's obviously a source of productivity growth in the last years, right? And so it's this grouping of measures that Brazil needs. And this will require a strong political leadership, a lot of alignment with Congress. And I have to say, I'm a little bit more optimistic than Roberto on that as well, because if you look at what Congress did, even in the Temer administration, which is one kind of administration, Bolsonaro administration, which is a different kind of administration, and the Lula administration, which is a whole different than those two, they keep doing those reforms, and the tax reform, the VAT reform is there to prove us in this sense. And I think this is going to be consequential. And therefore, if Congress and the political leadership, they get better aligned in continuing those reforms and extending them into the fiscal, I think we may have a better path. But obviously, and that's a point here that I usually make in my presentations, I start saying, well, as an economist, sometimes our discussions, they veer into politics very quickly, but, Brazil is not Brazil, and so on. And on paper, this is beautiful, but next year, it's going to be all about the election, and it's going to be all about the election because of these expectations of if the political leadership in Brazil will be convinced of the urgent need of those reforms. I think that there is some still convincement to be made. Some people are already there and will be there to continue these reforms, but we'll be very dependent on what happens in 2026, and that's what the market is going to be looking at, because again, the market is not looking at a short-term fiscal performance, it's looking at the structure, and I think that's one thing that we should have all in mind when analyzing the Brazilian situation going forward.
Thank you, Vinicius. That was excellent, but again, not very reassuring for the short run in terms of what could lie ahead. As you pointed out, the months ahead will be a difficult navigation, and with inflation continuing high. And this interplay between the expectation of interest rate cuts in an uncertain inflation environment and an unchanging fiscal concern. So a lot of the attention will be on what happens to the paths of interest rates and how will fixed income markets react. And it is our pleasure today to have with us, unfortunately not in person, but we have him through the magic of technology, to have with us Tadeu, who is someone that is not only observing but trading the markets and can give us a very good idea of what is ahead in terms of the expectations on inflation and interest rates. So a pleasure to have you here with us, Tadeu, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share here the presentation. I think I need authorization for sharing. Okay, now I got it. Sorry for the presentation. It's a little bit easier for me as I'm going to say a little. I'm going to take a little time. I'm going to try to respect the 10 minutes. It's not an easy test for Carioca. We usually get late at appointments and not respect time. Just a joke. But in general, I have good news, but with the bad reasons. I think we got a lot of effort to get it done, and that I'm going to show here. I made an exercise to show. I took the good years of inflation target that Brazil respected the inflation target, and I took some numbers what we need to achieve the inflation target regime. Inflation target in Brazil is a very tough to be achieved because it's very low if we take consideration fiscal needs and the historical dynamics. We need a very low inflation, service inflation, and food inflation to take the 3% number for the targets. Next year, the task for central bank is still food and service inflation next year. Industrial and managed prices are in a good position. Industrial because of China offering more goods and service from the commercial battle with the United States, and doing a lot of industrial at emerging markets, especially cars, and managed price because oil prices are going to come back to come back maybe under 60 in the next months, and we're going to be and reduce the gasoline prices. So just a small brief. In the years that we achieved inflation targets, we did it almost every time we did it with interest rates hovering more than two digits. In 2006 and 2007, we got 15% of real interest rates ex-ante in the next discount inflation in the next 12 months. In 2009, we got commodity price and output gap. In 2017, 2018, we got again a huge interest rates, almost 9 to 10%. And now we got a huge, again, interest rate, real interest rates of 11%. That, in my opinion, Brazilian economy cannot support that level for long. And we got at the same time, America, the not strong dollar, a weak dollar is going to help, is going to continue help our inflation dynamic. If you take a look at the real interest rates, we are at a very high level. That is, as Vinicius told and the other colleagues, is going to reduce inflation and reduce activity in the next year. The big task in Brazil for reducing the inflation of service inflation is the labor markets. We made an important survey here in Brazil. They asked the sectors, the service sector, how difficult it is to get to hire someone, and for almost 40% says that the big issue for growing is to find someone to work. That's the biggest problem now for inflation. But as the same service shows, we are this the service sectors is becoming more is not optimistic anymore. They are expecting to reduce the sales in the next months, and this gap between the expectation of sales from the service sectors and these labor markets are suggesting that we are very near to a layoff period, and that's going to help inflation next year. Also, 2000 and this year and next year, we had a very lucky environment for food. We got two standard deviation of yields above. I collect every commodity in Brazil, and we got extraordinary year with almost every commodity showing yields above trends. And this was when I aggregate everything, it showed two standard deviations of quality of yield above trends. So it was a magnificent year for food and for food production that helped a lot inflation. And I think in the next year, soybean is going to be the next crop, the next good crop, increasing up to 5% in the next year. United States, we also got pressure good grains crop with the good and exceptional conditions at the high of for a long time. So it was exceptional year for food around the globe. Here in Brazil, we do a survey too, and we ask the investment, the economist here, what is the best, he thinks is the sector that's going to have a pressure, and what is going to be the easier for the inflation sector. They pointed service as the most problem issue in Brazil, and the easier is going to be industrial. That's I told you before, industrial, because service and goods from China, especially cars, are coming to Brazil and helping to reduce industrial price. That is the problem. We need a very high interest rate to cover our problems and to support fiscal imbalances. The carry to vol in Brazil the carry to vol in Brazil currency is the highest one, and we need this to appreciate the exchange rate and have a good dynamics in inflation. So we have good news, but with the bad reasons, as I told in the beginning. And last but not least, the biggest issue next year is going to be the activity, the slowing pace of activity, and in the other side we're going to have a huge credit impulse from government, the fiscal numbers going to be huge in the next year, and it is a problem for central bank in controlling the inflation, and it is going to help to come back with the activity level. So the big problem is that Brazil economists now is taking consideration is that the credit impulse that are going to help activity in the next year is and it is giving a lot of trouble to central bank to cutting the interest rates next year. That and one thing that Brazil is having now, we had in the last week a position covering because investors are investing a lot. They are very optimistic about Brazil and interest rates in markets and equity. And if you have anything that happens we see last Friday, Brazil markets they show a position covering, and we have a high volatility as we saw in the last Friday. That is it. We have a good numbers for next year. We have 4.5 this year and 4% next year. But as I told you before, with the bad reasons, because we need to put a lot of efforts to achieve good numbers. Thank you.
Thank you, Tadeu. We now turn to a perspective more focused on the equity markets and some of the sectoral outlooks. And so we are very fortunate to have with us our good friend Cadu, if we may call him. Everybody calls him Cadu, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you for inviting me for this conference. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, so I'll try to be a little more bit on Brazil. I'm also an economist and understand perfectly, the concerns of my colleagues, and I'm concerned too. But somebody has to try to give some better prospects. So, well, first of all, Brazilian equities are doing very well this year. Equities are up like close to 40% in dollars, which is great, but has nothing to do with Brazil, by the way. All markets in the region are up by similar numbers. I mean, you see Mexico up close to 40%, Chile up close to 40%, Colombia even more. And they're very different countries with very different situations and issues. And what is driving really this performance is a rotation out of the U.S. A lot of money concentrated in the U.S. and some money with all these different policies by the newly elected government in the U.S. Some of this money is looking for some diversification in other markets, and we have been benefiting from that, similarly to other emerging market countries and our peers in Latin America. So we know good that we are up that much, not because of Brazil, but because of the global environment. When we look at valuations in Brazil, they are cheap. Brazil is trading today at, I'll give the number, but might not mean much, but we are trading at 9.4 times PE, excluding Petrobras and Vale. If we add Petrobras and Vale, is around 8.4 times PE, which is cheap. Right, it's a 1 standard deviation below average. Even after the 40% performance this year, it's still 1 standard deviation below average. So for whoever is looking at emerging markets and looking for cheap countries and cheap valuations, they will find that in Brazil. When I say cheap, looking only at PE is one way to look at that, but then we go back to being a little gloomier. When we compare these to long-term interest rates in Brazil, which are very high, right? We have long-term rates that are, last time I looked, it was around 7.7%. In that ballpark. When we adjust the PE for that, then the premium to own equities in Brazil today is small, right? Compared to the long-term rates, it's on average, it's in line with average, which doesn't, maybe leave much room for an improvement unless long-term rates fall, which, based on the fiscal forecast, it's not what we would expect to see unless there is a big change to the way either this administration, which is unlikely, or the new one tackle the fiscal situation, right? It's also interesting to note that the long-term rates in Brazil also usually behave looking at what happens to long-term rates in the U.S. Long-term rates in the U.S. have been coming down lately. It's around 1.7% real rates. But the rates in Brazil are not coming down. They are going the other direction. They're going up a little bit. So the premium between long-term rates in Brazil and long-term rates in the U.S. have been widening. It's around 6 percentage points now, which again, it's the negative side, it's very high. The positive side, it's very high. And, if we do something right, it might come down. So that's what we're hoping to see. Maybe some change to the political, to the fiscal, the way these, even if this administration is reelected, that they'll have to tackle the situation eventually, right? Otherwise, things will blow. I think one thing that is important to see too is we have the easing cycle starting in the U.S. Right, rates were cut 25 bips in September. We are expecting another cut now in the next meeting. This usually helps emerging market countries, right? So what we saw already in September after the first cut was a record amount of money flowing into GEM funds, global emerging market funds, in September. We believe that as rates continue to move down, more money will flow into global emerging market funds. Usually, Brazil being an emerging market, we benefit with part of that money coming into Brazilian equities. We saw that in September. In October now, even though the money continues to flow into emerging market funds, we saw outflows from Brazil, and mainly, I think, because of the fiscal situation again. I mean, there are some announcements. The latest one that I think spooked everybody was this announcement that maybe the government will look to freeze bus tariffs, right, which would cost so much money. It would cost so much money that I don't think it's doable. But anyways, everybody gets afraid of this type of announcements. So I think that had a negative impact on flows in October and on the equity markets also. One thing that, we have the easing cycle in the U.S., and we hope to see the easing cycle starting in Brazil also soon. I mean, there is I think today market consensus that the easing will start in January next year. We have to view everybody thinks rates will come down. Roberto is a little less optimistic with how much rates can come down. Vinicius is a little more optimistic. We are in between. We have 12% rates by the end of 2026, which would be a 300 bips reduction to rates. And that has a very positive impact on domestic companies' earnings. So the companies that are basically selling goods in Brazil that usually leverage up or take that on linkage to the Selic rate, these companies tend to benefit from lower rates directly just by paying less interest expenses. So we made a quick estimate on how much earnings would go up for these companies, these domestic companies, for every 100 bips reduction in the Selic rate, and it's about somewhere between 4 and 5% increase in earnings. So we are modeling for Brazilian earnings, domestic companies' earnings, so companies selling basically in Brazil, earnings should grow 17% in nominal terms in 2026, which is kind of 3 times more than what we expect the GDP to grow in nominal terms, which is positive. And usually that's the case when we have this cycle. Usually the earnings performance is strong. So that also supports a somewhat more positive view on equities in Brazil, looking at the next months. The combination of the monetary easing cycle in the U.S. and the monetary easing cycle is starting in Brazil in January. Usually this is a powerful combination that help equities in emerging markets in Brazil specifically to perform well. So we are, in that sense, we are a little more optimistic with the dynamics in the short term. And then we have elections, and elections can change everything, can change the speed in which rates are cut, can change the fiscal, the way this administration deals with the fiscal situation, and increasing spending is a natural trend when we are in elections year. I agree very much to what Roberto said. I mean, if the market perceives that there's going to be a change to the political situation, and whoever is coming next is going to really address the fiscal situation, improvement start much before even the government starts, the new government starts. So usually what happens is that the long-term rates are moving lower, reduce the pressure on the financing, the nominal deficit comes down. So that's what we, that's a hope that we have. But naturally, between now and elections, so many things can happen. We don't even know who is the opposition candidate at this point. All we know is that the sitting president is a very, very competitive candidate. So let's see how it goes. But I think at some point, starting early next year, I think elections today already, the news flow, the electoral news flow today already drives market prices up or down in the short term a little bit. I think we are so far away from elections that we don't have a trend at this point. We have markets reacting to the daily news flow, but not a trend. Eventually, earlier next year, with the definition of the opposition candidate and what the polls are saying, because any second round simulation at this point will show President Lula with around 40-ish% voting intentions, a little more than 40, 45, and whoever is the other guy with a number that is similar. Because nobody really, there is a people today that would like to vote for President Lula and the people that vote against him. It doesn't matter who is on the other side of the ballots. So before we have the definition, I think it's all a big guess on what will happen to elections next year. But we should have some definition earlier next year because of so some definition early next year, and I think at that point we will start to see some trends and what will happen. So I'll stop here, and I hope I gave you a little more to hope for.
Thank you, Cadu. That was excellent. I mean, it's good to be reminded of the truism, and that is that business in Brazil never stops. And so even though macroeconomists may give their woes every day, I mean, people are really making a lot of money in São Paulo and other places, and there are always business opportunities. It's just that we as analysts and macro people, we see that there is so much potential that could be so much better, and so that triggers our sort of ingrained pessimism about why aren't things going better when they could be going so much better. But with that, I'm very pleased to introduce my co-moderator, Drauzio Giacometti. He will lead us from now on. Please, Drauzio.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for hosting. I'd like to start as Carlos did. It's not only Latin America, the stock markets are 40 or so up. You go to some in Asia and some in Europe, they're also 40 and something up, which means that this common factor is quite strong. And will probably be so for some time. The question is, with so much uncertainty, or with the scenarios that our economists were discussing, why so much political uncertainty, fiscal uncertainty, monetary policy uncertainty? And I think that's the answer, really. There's so much uncertainty. And you look back, elections are 50-50, close to 50-50. So people are just tossing a coin, said, I don't know, so I shouldn't act on something I don't know. So let's act on what we know, which is the dollar, the rotation away from the U.S. and the margin to EM. That's benefiting us. But this will change, and that's one thing I'd like to ask our panelists. I think there's no reason to expect any change in the near term. Maybe the governor of São Paulo will say something by the end of March. And I understand that he still has until August to maybe opt out and run for the state anyway. So chances are for a good part of the next 9 months, it's going to be a coin toss, and that will keep external drivers at the helm. But again, along the way, maybe late March and some point mid-year, we'll have a better sense, or the odds are, and I think markets will adjust. So the question, I would start with our economists, is the question is, we haven't talked about scenarios, and assume it, we'll just toss this coin and make it A and B, continuation or change. How do you see elections playing out if you look beyond just 2026 and into 27, how that would affect your prospects? Because you talked, Roberto, about 250 billion of adjustment. Probably is even more, no? As things evolve, because President Lula is proposing measures that could add 100 billion next year in credit and some additional expenditures. So it's plus 100, and then some credits may be so some credits may be wound up, but then you have the extra expenditures. So the question is, let's look in a crystal ball as how can this unfold? Start in the same order with you, Roberto.
Elections can be somewhat binary, but I think at the end of the day, the challenge is not the 2026, but is what happened between 2027 to 2030, like the next minute. And whoever wins, like the belief is, and I share that muddling through won't be an option in fiscal terms, because debt continues to grow and the deficit is very large. Real interest rates are very high. But then the question is whether whoever wins is forced to implement changes or is willing to implement changes. And that can make a big difference in the sense that credibility matters, right? Especially if we're talking about like unleashing a cycle of market optimism. And we've seen with this administration, actually, there was a lot of skepticism about delivering the primary targets, the primary fiscal targets in 2024, 2025. 2026 is a question mark. But 2023, 2024, they were delivered. 2025, the target will likely be delivered. A target that does not stabilize debt. But there were questions there. And they did the right thing, and they kept pushing for the measures that would allow the delivery of the target. But by the time it was delivered, it was too little, too late. Markets had already moved on. Like the delivery of those targets did not buy the credibility that would have been necessary. So it is very important, I think, to differentiate between the paths that bring us there. So even if muddling through is not an alternative, the approach, whether it is proactive or reactive, can make all the difference in terms of how the scenarios play out. So this is to say, like, basically, if whoever wins is not showing the pragmatism that is necessary for the reforms that are unpopular, that include changing entitlements and social entitlements and minimum levels of spending in education and healthcare and so on, markets will force that to eventually happen, and it will be much more costly than if it is a voluntary, so to speak, adjustment, right? So, like, in that process, I think, like, we can see a somewhat binary outcome in the sense that someone who's not willing to implement reforms could see interest rates, like especially the long end of the yield curve, widen quite a bit, and conditions stress out, and FX depreciate, and inflation pick up, and until the reforms are presented, versus one that comes out of the gates presenting a platform that addresses that. But even the one that presents those measures as part of a political program, I think markets might be quite excited about it, but the ability to deliver will eventually come into question. So, like, the truth always lives somewhere in the middle. But my point is just, like, if the scenarios can be binary in the immediate aftermath of elections and what they price in. But I think whoever wins will have very limited scope for muddling through, meaning that things will have to be done. If they are done because markets are imposing that is a much more costly way to get to the same point that the other candidate could. without being as pressured there. I am avoiding to give you point estimates, yes. But I think the path to getting to the other side matters, and the willingness and how much credibility a candidate brings into it can make a lot of difference on how markets perform from point A to point B.
Yeah, that's and I acknowledge that point forecasts are close to some of the least useful forecasts we can have, because
I
we want
agree.
to have a distribution around a scenario and a thought process, and thank you for that. But a quick follow-up. If I understand you well, you're saying it's a matter of how much market pressure there will be to force the opposition's hand, probably not much if it's Tarcísio or someone, or the incumbent's hand, which would be a lot. But you are considering one way or another certain degree of market pressure will push them into fiscal adjustment. Having gone through all this Robin Hood politics, do you think that the scenario of a debt restructuring will be in the cards with maybe low probability, but do you think that will be in the cards?
Brazil's debt is overwhelmingly funded locally, right? Like 95% is in local currency. We don't really, I don't think we tend to see debt restructuring in those terms. Like the flip side of that is that inflation expectations, right? Like it's what happens with market expectations on whether the government would inflate the debt away or not, or like it's I'm not concerned about debt restructuring because and it's interesting because the profile of debt in Brazil is very different today than what it was in the early 2000s, right? In the early 2000s, over 50% of debt was owed in hard currency. That provided a very clear line in terms of the restrictions we have. We're not able to print hard currency, so there's only so far that you can go, and after that point, either you do the right thing or you do the right thing, because there's no muddling through. The fact that the debt profile nowadays allows the extended muddling through is one of the reasons why we're here. It's easier to postpone the moment of adjustment because you don't see as clear an event as debt restructuring, as you're saying, because the profile of debt does not require that. But as I said, on the other hand, like where those doubts are expressed are on the trajectory of inflation and the temptation of inflating debt away. So.
Thank you. I was reading an interesting article in the U.S. yesterday where inflating part of the debt here is kind of default view. Well, it happened in the pandemic, 10% was kind of wiped out like that, and still we are 120 or so. So that's the default view that eventually inflation will wipe out part of the debt in the U.S. In Brazil, it's a lot harder for the reasons as you said. I think that just around 10% of the debt is really inflatable. Right? It's a bit much harder unless you accelerate things. But I think that it's even harder to default. So a lot of market pressure will build anyway. But Vinicius, the same question for you. How do you see elections playing out and the impact on macro and market variables?
I think Roberto's views are in line with what we would be saying here. What I would entertain here is the possibility that we have an outsider. And I say this because, the leader of the opposition cannot speak and won't be able to run. And so far, he hasn't been very vocal on who he would support. And there is indications in the press that is even some conflicts within the right-wing camp. His family, as you mentioned, Tarcísio, other politicians from the centrist party, on who would run under a Bolsonaro platform. And I bring the case of the São Paulo city mayoral elections, where you had a leftist candidate supported by President Lula. You had a center-right candidate he had the support of Governor Tarcísio, and a very soft support from President Bolsonaro. And what happened is that in the end, you had an outsider very much behaviorally like Bolsonaro, that almost made to the second round, and if he made to the second round, the polls were suggesting that he would be able to get elected for mayor. So I think there's now this election is it can be open depending on how the opposition functions. What I would say is that sometimes we associate this outsider kind of profile as negative, but it could be negative, it could be positive. My point here being that maybe we'll have more uncertainty than we are entertaining throughout the electoral process because of this unclear approach from the right wing. I think it's clear that the centrist parties, they want to get together with a single candidate, but obviously here the kingmaker tends to be former President Bolsonaro, who still is the leader of the opposition, and in this sense, what he does or he doesn't do, it's gonna shift the probabilities on these scenarios of who can win and who can run under the platform of opposition of President Lula. Obviously, I think that the market, at least as a first reaction, it would see continuity and non-continuity as a binary scenario. But as Roberto mentioned, when the government starts, that's when you see things happening. And as we mentioned, the challenges are big. And therefore, you have to have someone there who is willing to make those reforms and has the ability to make those reforms as well. And so maybe, depending on what happens, you could have extended uncertainty even after the election.
Thank you. Thank you, Vinicius.
May I interrupt you for a second? Vinicius, but going back to the same question, do you think that in the eventuality that there is no initiative or clear initiative at the beginning of the next administration, do you think that the market could apply enough pressure to force an adjustment? Or what would happen is basically a crisis, and then the outcome is still uncertain.
That's hard to say. What I would bring is that if you look at President Lula's popularity at the last couple of months, it has gone up very, very fast, and President Lula has had some successes in Congress as well. So he's probably at his strongest position politically in over a year. And this hasn't changed the approach from the opposition, right? So you would have expected to see the opposition also reacting to what happens on the incumbent, right? That's how it happens in every election. But so far we haven't seen this. Maybe it's because we are too far from the election, or maybe because that's the reaction function. We don't know. I at least don't know how they're going to do it, and it became really hard right now because there isn't a single leader in this movement, and it seems that there's no distractions within the right wing. They are big at this point. Maybe with time they will come together, but that's still to be seen. I don't think that the market would make a change on this. I think that maybe the electoral prospects would, but so far they haven't.
We'll see. I think the changes will be a lot more profound and not only restricted to the choice of president, because one way or another, it's the end of this left, the Lula movement. Because you see the center parties, I think what will happen in Congress will be very interesting to follow as well, because the center parties now, they are on the fence trying to pick who is the most likely winner. They have no attachment to one side or the other. Now the moment, because, well, Lula is electable, maybe Tarcísio is, so they are sitting on this fence. The moment that Lula is not re-electable anymore, even if he wins, I think it's a completely different ballgame. So 2027, in terms of leaderships going forward, I think for the center parties, the dynamics change completely one way or another. in ways that I don't know. But I'll ask the Carioca view from Tadeu. How do you think it plays out?
We do a lot of visiting banks and assets here, and I'm going to say my colleague here, José, view. If it's going to be left, we're going to see more of the same, more expenditures, fiscal imbalances, high rates, and low artificial inflation. But when we did a roadshow in the last months, funds and assets and banks, they are high conviction of Tarcísio. I think it's quite different of that we hear before, but the market has a high conviction of Tarcísio, and because they think that is the most probable score scenario for the right, and they say that Lula has a negative gravity that is going to come down in the next year because of violence and the polarity that people are tired of, left and right extremes. And if we had a one more term for the left, I think market is going to shake a lot. That's the view, because nobody that I talk even consider the possibility. I think that's extreme that I'm saying, but is the view that we hear, and I think some of that just a low. We don't have this now in markets. Have a lot of this not everything priced in. A lot of to price this scenario. But it's the high conviction trades of almost everyone that I talk.
If I may, maybe you got a sense of what people have in their portfolios, what they favor. Did you get a sense of whether they favor FX rates or equities?
Yes, they like long-term real rates. It's very expensive yet if you compare with equities. And equities too, the PE is very low, as our colleague here told, and interest rates is going to come down a lot of too. But I think the most expensive market is the real interest rate in the long term.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to turn to you, Carlos, to talk more equities in particular, because I think that's the most interesting asset out there. As much as real rates are high, if you want to invest in the long end of the curve and hedge FX, you don't get much actually to pay for that. So if this common factor is very important, all this 40% that we mentioned at the beginning, if the common factor is very relevant, and I think it will remain so, for an investor that wants to earn the yield, it has to go to FX or equities unhedged. And rates, as attractive as it is, becomes a more difficult proposition unless you take the FX risk, which brings us back to FX and equities. And looking forward, how do you play it in the near term, if you want to go into sectors or like the dynamics, or how you position as we approach elections?
Okay. Well, first of all, the whole election, I think we are going to go through several phases between now and elections, right? I mean, the first one being where we are today. I think President Lula improvement in popularity improvement, in a way, was kind of expected, right? It was going to happen, sooner or later. I think the whole thing with Trump helped him improve faster than maybe he would have if Trump were not there. But I think, and then you guys probably know that better than I do, I think food inflation was key for President Lula improvement in the short term. So, it's very nice to talk about Trump and all the fights and everything else, But really, my view at least, what makes the bulk of the difference in President Lula popularity improvement was the fact that food inflation came down from what we had in the beginning of the year to today. And if you look at where he improved more with poor people in the northeast of the country, which is usually more sensitive to food prices. So, I think we are in a place where most people would think the election is kind of maybe 50-50, right? Nobody really knows much. I don't see any big changes in the very short term, unless, and again, Bolsonaro is key to that, and unless Bolsonaro decides to make a big announcement on who he's going to support in the next months, I don't think the scenario will change much. And then we are back to rates, right? I mean, rates fall in the U.S., rates fall in Brazil. I think equity prices might continue to react to that, or either if it's sooner or later or more or less intense, the cuts, I think equities will probably react to that. Earlier next year, there is a very important date, which is April next year, when the governor of São Paulo, which is the main, or at least the candidate that most of, at least us at Faria Lima would cheer for, which is the governor of São Paulo, running. He has to make a decision by April whether he runs for re-election, which is an easy re-election. He would be easily re-elected governor of São Paulo, or if he abandons the government, to run for president. And I think that he will only do that, or only run for president, if he has a full support of the Bolsonaro family, which we never know, right? Bolsonaro, the decision-making process of the Bolsonaro and the family is, I don't think anyone knows how it works. So we don't know what happened there. But I think it's a key date. So I think if Tarcísio decides to leave office to run for president, I think market price will react positively to that. And then we'll go back to polls and looking how he performs and all. As I said before, I think if Lula is leading the polls and his re-election becomes more likely, asset prices will deteriorate. I mean, the FX will go up, equities will go down, the usual things that happens when people are not that confident with election. On the other hand, if Tarcísio is leading the polls, or whoever is, I say Tarcísio because he's the most likely one, but any of the other center-right candidates that decide to run, if they're leading the polls, I think asset prices will improve even before elections. And what is interesting is even if Lula comes up with an announcement saying that he's going to be fiscally responsible, and nobody will believe that, right, before he's there. So asset prices will deteriorate anyways if Lula is leading the polls. On the other hand, even if the center-right governor doesn't say anything about the fiscal, the asset price will improve because people believe that he's going to take actions in that direction. So very different phases between now and elections, I think, and equity price and volatility will be there. I mean, asset prices and equity prices will be going up and down a lot because of these, depending on what happens. On sectors, what we are doing today and the way we are positioning the portfolio is we are looking at the long-term real rates via stocks that are more exposed to long-term real rates coming down. So that's how we are trying to play Brazil. So we have a very small exposure to exporters at this point. So we have most of the portfolio invested in Brazilian stocks that react positively to improvements in the Brazilian political or economic scenario, but focus on companies that are less cyclical, in a sense that they will be less impacted by the decelerating economy that we expect to see in the third and fourth quarter of this year. So more resilient in terms of earnings, but that would react very positively to falling long-term rates if that happens.
Some example,
Utilities, for instance, infrastructure names. So, I can give you stock names. I don't know if that's the forum, but we like when you look at utilities, we like Equatorial, Energisa, Copel, Eletrobras. All these stocks should do well. Unless there is a catastrophe, but they should do fine in the next quarters, and they will do very well if rates come down. We like a little more riskier names, maybe Localiza, less risky Motiva. So those that are also infrastructure names, long duration cash flows and all. So we like that, and we like the financial services as well. Not because we work for banks, but some banks in Brazil are doing very well. We cannot even have BTG Pactual in the portfolio. So I'm not, but we have Itaú in the portfolio, for instance. So that's what we're doing.
I think what the governor of São Paulo does carries a higher weight. There are several competitive candidates on the right, but he carries a higher weight because it reviews his preference, his view on the elections. If he says no, it's because he believes he cannot beat Lula. Right?
Yeah.
If he says yes, it's because they do believe that they can beat him. So it'll be interesting to see. Just a quick follow-up. In terms of upside, you said valuations are good. Like if there's let's say he runs, there's a good outcome in the horizon. How much pickup do you think there is?
In equities?
Yeah.
So if we go back to the average, so we are trading today at 9.4, as I said, 9.4 times PE, which is 1 standard deviation below average. If we go back to average, it's 40% up from where we are. Usually when people get excited about these things and, if Tarcísio is leading the pools and all, usually there's an overshoot. We're probably going to trade maybe 1 standard deviation above average. So we'll go from 1 below to 1 above. It can go up, I don't want to, it can go up more than 50%, between 50 and, if a center-right candidate is leading the polls and about to win, asset prices in Brazil will go up a lot.
Yeah, and it's hard for me at least to see any other asset class beating equities in this scenario. But I think we have some time for questions. I see hands here. Yeah, there's a microphone over there, please, if you have a question.
Good morning, I'm David Bond from White & Case. I just had a question maybe for Roberto or Vinicius. I think the one thing that characterizes U.S. politics now is neither party is very serious about addressing our deficit. One is addicted to spending and the other is addicted to tax cuts. So I'm curious to know, in terms of center-right politics in Brazil, is there really the will to address the deficit?
I can start and then I'll share it with Vinicius, but I think it's quite telling when you see. So there's this project to increase the income tax exemption in Brazil to 5,000 reais, and basically that includes another 16 million Brazilians stand to no longer pay income taxes starting next year. And that obviously has a cost. 30 billion reais is estimated for the first year, but the government is proposing offsets, right? Like, so that the rich pay for that. So it's not fiscally irresponsible, but there is what I believe is a populist tilt to it that was approved by the lower house by 493 votes to 0. And we're waiting for the vote in the Senate. And I think this is just emblematic. There's no left, right, or center when it comes to populist measures in Brazil. It could have been much worse. It could have been unfunded, and actually that's what caused all the spiral, the downward spiraling of markets last November, December, was the introduction of this project to increase the income tax exemption and the fear that it would just create a hole in the budget. So it could have been much worse. But my point is, for fiscal initiatives, I think political lines get very blurred in Brazil, and there's no the party of this, the party of that. That's why I was saying that I think that the leadership from the president will be very important in guiding Congress through this. Congress does not do the job by itself. It really depends on the leadership of the president to guide us, and depending on who wins elections, like either changes will be forced by an extreme market sell-off, or they will be welcomed by the anticipation of those reforms. And so it's like that's the binary aspect of elections that I see. I think that there's very little leeway to escape 4 years of changes once we start 2027. But to me, the lines are very blurred, and that means that a lot falls on the executive, specifically on the president, to lead that process.
Yeah. So I think The world has migrated to this new environment where, using fiscal policy in order to boost growth and to boost electoral prospects became even more appealing from the views of the politicians, at least. I would argue against it, to be honest, because what I've seen around is politicians having more trouble with inflation, high inflation, than having trouble with some sort of expenditure cuts or tax hikes. At least that's my experience in the last 5 or 6 years. But it's there, right? So I think it's still difficult to make this adjustment, even if Roberto wants to do a 250 billion adjustment here. We need to know. I'm just joking, but even if like is an economist like that knows the challenges and so on, is elected president, even for him it would be very hard, right? I mean, because this equation is not easy to be solved, right? The point I think is that you would have to be balanced out how much the next administration, whoever wins, is willing also to listen to the private sector, who is saying like this, maybe this equilibrium is unsustainable, where you have very high interest rates, where you have this fiscal spending, and Ambassador Sobel mentioned even Governor Galípolo talking about fiscal versus rates, and I think that's the reality. And if whoever wins is willing to listen to this, trying to find a better equilibrium between both of them, it would be positive for the political world, it would be positive for inflation, it would be positive across the board. So I think that there's a case there as well, even though you're right in saying that at these days, politicians, they are less and less inclined to believe in this story as they were maybe by the end of the 90s across the EM space and DM space.
Hey, thank you. I think I saw some hands in the back.
Hi, my name is Yasmin, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to create the logic of the question, but I'll try. So before, Brazil invested a lot in infrastructure, and the government was criticized that he was spending a lot, but this make it possible for Brazil to grow after we had power plants and everything that we need to increase productivity. And I think what Vinicius, I believe, said is that we are growing production, but not productivity. And growing production doesn't mean growing income or taxes. So what do we need to do to increase productivity? That is my main questions, because we are too focused on politics, and I do believe that it starts with politicians to increase everything that we need to do, but what we are expecting to see the growth of income in the future.
I think that's the critical question. Who wants to go first? What do you have to do to increase productivity?
That's a hard one, but what I would say is that Brazil has taken some steps on this direction. I think the VAT reform is an important one in that regard. As I mentioned in my initial remarks, I think this is very consequential for Brazil growth, but it's probably not enough, right? And I think that as a group of reforms, the recommendation is kind of known since the 90s in Brazil, right? I mean, you have to open up the economy, and Brazil, now we are not facing too much trouble with this deglobalization because Brazil hasn't opened up the economy enough, right? Brazil has to make it streamline red tape. If you make the comparison between U.S. policies and European policies, and how many of the global leading companies, AI and so on, that are coming from the private sector in the U.S. versus Europe, you see there that these differences in approach, they make a very significant difference in the outcome as well, of the economic outcome. And in the U.S., even with tariffs, even with the end of, not the end, but curbing immigration and so on, this year's first half growth was only about productivity. So this shows how the rules of the private sector can be quite important. And I think that the final one is, you mentioned it, like investing in infrastructure is key, but there's only enough money and you have to prioritize. What has been characterized in the Brazilian economy is a very low savings economy, even from the private sector, but mainly from the public sector. And the consequence of this is that you have less space for investments. And even though there is obviously positives on this, because you're making the population consume more, and so their standard of living is higher than before, there is a cost to be paid. And this cost is that there's less investment, there's less productivity, there's less energy, and so on. So changing this balance again is not easy, and it's probably not going to be solved by the next administration or the next one after that. You require significant macroeconomic changes for the next 10 to 20 years. Again, I'm not trying to be pessimistic on this. To the opposite, I think we're already taking some steps on this direction, on improving our financial sector. Brazil is moving forward with the VAT reform. Brazil is making the agreement with the Eurozone on free trade, and there seems to be some willingness to extend this and so on. So I think we are on the right track for the last 10 years, 10 years before that without major reforms. But you're going to need more. And once you have more productivity and more growth, growth tends to solve problems, right? I mean, you solve fiscal problems, you solve social problems, you solve political problems, and so on. But it has to be sustainable, and it's not easy to do it.
And I see two more questions, and we have just a couple minutes, so I'd like to combine those two. I think one there. And just one for you to bear in mind on the last question. Almost half of the workforce is informal. If you bring it to the grid, a more effective grid, you see the potential is huge. If you could ask your question, then we combine those two.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vitor Granja, and my question is, in a hypothetical scenario, if you were the current president of Brazil with, congressional opposition, 50% tariff, and a looming election, what would you do to raise $250 billion to stabilize the economy, the debt?
Okay, and the question is? Cut the waste. Okay, I'll let the guys talk.
Hey. My question is regarding the relationship that currently U.S. has with China and how challenging and important it is for Brazil, to conciliate commerce and investments with both economies.
Roberto, do you want to get us started?
Personally attacked there. So it's not $250 billion, it's 250 reais. So that's a fifth of the challenge. I think nothing will get done overnight, but it is about addressing inefficiencies in the public sector, the minimum levels of spending that are constitutional, that were reenacted by this administration. They were fixed in real terms, but they were turned back on, so to speak, again. And it doesn't necessarily make sense. The population is aging. It does not make as much sense to spend as much in education as we did 20 years ago as a percentage of GDP or total revenues for a population that is aging, whereas maybe you should spend more in healthcare. Or the fact that discretionary spending is only 8% of the budget, and a fourth of that is budget amendments, emendas, for Congress. So that's one thing that hurts structural investments that the government was able to do before. Now 50 billion reais every year go to very diffused investments set up by congressmen that do not do not have the same punch as 50 billion that were invested in infrastructure, for example. And so there's a lot of rearrangements that need to be done, and that is something that likely, as I said, will probably take more than 4 years. That's why I say it's not so much about 2026, it's 2027 through 2030 and beyond. but it has to start somewhere, and making the minimum wage growth more compatible with productivity trends. Unfortunately, as Vinicius was saying, productivity is low in Brazil. So, like, are we in a place to give real increases to the minimum wage every year that compounds the fiscal problem because of a growing number of retired people that access that? Like, we're giving above productivity growth to retirees whose productivity by definition is zero. So it's like it's a lot of unpopular challenges that are ahead that are not done overnight, and it will take the leadership of a president to get the Congress to support. But the good news is that it's 250 billion reais, not dollars. So.
And on China, anyone wants to comment on China?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of research on this, and so I'll take this one. If you look at the 2018 trade war, and you're going to see the answers for what Brazil should do in this trade war as well. There's in general, there's two major producers of commodities in the world where there's growth in the commodity sector, and those two countries are the US and Brazil. Right? Brazil, about 40 years ago, was a major exporter of only iron ore. Now we're a major exporter of iron ore, maybe rare earths in the future, we don't know, but food and oil as well. Brazil in July produced more oil in a month than Iran, which obviously, the countries are different, but this would be unthinkable 10 years ago. And so this is a sector where Brazil has a competitive edge and whose main competitor is the US. And it happens that main consumer is China. And when the US and China are in a trade war, and the reasons behind this trade war, there's a lot of discussion about this and research on this. I won't go into it, but regardless of that, Brazil can and did outperform its production and exports to China because of that, right? Because of this fight. And that's how Brazil should try to be placed at this point, in a point where Brazil is still close to the US. Brazil, for example, almost 2% of Brazil's imports of services come from digital services, and the large majority of this comes from the US. So the ties between Brazil and the US, they are there. But Brazil should use this opportunity to export more to China and use this global division and try to navigate in the middle. That's a very hard thing to do, right? Maybe the question would be, if you were a sitting president, how would you do? Maybe the ambassador here would know. I wouldn't know how to do it, but I hope there's someone in the Brazil government and the Itamaraty that knows how to do it.
Okay, very good. We are 5 minutes past, and with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for the excellent presentations.
Okay, I think we have a brief break, 10 minutes, no more, and then we will continue with our next panel. With such distinguished panelists here by my side, I'm going to, so this is how it's going to play out. I'm going to briefly introduce myself, give the panelists 1 or 2 minutes to briefly introduce themselves, and then I am going to lay down my opening remarks and give a little bit of what we are seeing regarding all this noise of the tariffs that we've been seeing, and it's been a part of our lives and a part of how companies have been dealing with. So, and then this is going to be 15 minutes. Then we're going to have a 45-minute chat here with my moderators, and then we'll open for Q&A. So I also have online. I don't
see her, Bruna Santos, but I believe that she is online listening to us. So I'm going to briefly start introducing myself. So I'm Eduardo Warrington. I am here representing, I have two hats here. One is Bradesco. I've been a banker at Bradesco for over 27 years. And currently I work in New York at the New York branch, taking care of the corporate and investment banking division. And I also have the head of being a treasurer and board member of BRATEC. BRATEC is the Brazilian Texas Chamber of Commerce, an institutional partner of Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce in this event. BRATEC is a chamber of commerce that fosters a relationship between Brazilians and Americans, especially those from Texas, Brazilian and American, and Texan companies, and promoting business between the two geographies. So I am going to go ahead and hand it over to my colleagues so they can introduce themselves briefly, starting here by my left, David from White & Case, a partner, and thank you for sponsoring this event.
No, it's our pleasure. Good morning. I'm David Bond. I'm the global head of the trade practice at White & Case. What does that mean? It means in the United States, it's customs, tariff type issues that we'll be talking about today, trade litigation, export controls, sanctions, and CFIUS, foreign direct investment issues. We also have substantial presences and offices in Brussels and Geneva, London, also Mexico City, and in China and Japan. So it really is a global trade practice. Thanks very much for allowing me to speak to you this morning.
Thanks, David. On my right, Roberto Ardenghi. He is the president and the CEO of IBP.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much, Eduardo, for the invitation. Thank you for the chamber also to have us. The Brazilian Petroleum Gas and Biofuels Institute is the oldest industry organization covering this area in Brazil. We have been created in 1957, originally by Petrobras and a small group of executives from the petrochemical industry. And the institute evolved over time, as Brazil also evolved in terms of gas and oil production. Today, Brazil is the 9th largest producer in the world for oil and gas. We are exporting 1.7 million barrels of oil per day. This sector is becoming more and more important in terms of the size in the industry and relevance in terms of jobs creation, payment of taxes. So it's a pleasure to be with you and maybe to discuss those important issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. And now we have Bruna Santos. Bruna is a director of the Brazil program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Bruna? We don't hear you.
No?
Okay. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay. Well, welcome. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation for me to be here. I'm really thrilled. I'm director of the Brazil program here at the Inter-American Dialogue. We are the only country-focused think tank here in Washington, focusing only on Brazil. We have a focus on Brazil-U.S. relations, a focus on also sustainability, energy transition, sustainable agriculture, and obviously a lot of our time these days is focused on assessing and explaining Brazil to the foreign audiences here. My trajectory spans from Brazilian government, private sector, a long career also in China, and I hope to learn more from my colleagues here in this panel. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Bruna. Okay, I'm going to lay down a few opening remarks to set up the discussion. and if you allow me, I'm going to read some of these remarks. So tariffs can be significant and have significant sectoral impacts. But we at Bradesco, we feel that the overall impact doesn't seem that bad. To illustrate this, I brought a few slides to give a little bit of what we're seeing. And on this first slide that is projected, that was prepared by the Bradesco Macroeconomic Research Department in Osasco, São Paulo. It shows that it is not that relevant, the amount of our exports to the U.S. So Brazil has, give or take, $350 billion of exports per year. And to the U.S. markets, slightly above 11%, which roughly that's about $40 billion per year. So, and the most relevant market by far is China, and which represents about $100 billion per year. So, with no other markets representing more than 4%. And when you look at the pizza chart on that is projected, there's a very important 19% of this is oil and derivatives. That has been a growing sector. Iron ore is 16%. And all other sectors, they are not more than 8%, being aircrafts and the Embraer jet, 7% of the export. So it's pretty diluted, and which makes it a comfortable export let's say wallet that we have. So when we look at the distribution of these sectors on this next slide, so and relate them to the importance that they have, we come up where we have on the x-axis the exports coefficient. So that's, in other words, the relevance that these exports have in relation to the total sales of the companies and of production of Brazil. And on the y-axis, the dependence of this on the U.S. So you can, looking at this chart, you don't want to be on the first quadrant where orange is right now and coffee is. So you want to be more on the second or the third quadrant where most of the sectors are. So we are in pretty good shape when it comes to exports to U.S. once again. And so the red dots is where there were recent exemptions to the tariffs. This slide just shows the regional importance, and it's a really hard to read, but the dark shaded state, which is Espírito Santo, that one has 1% of what the share of the state GDP that is linked to the U.S. economy. So once again, that's the worst case. All others are below 1%. So our outlook for this impact of the tariffs is when you looking at this chart like a timeline. So you see on the first scenario, when Trump, whatever Trump announced on the Liberation Day, that's the first scenario right there, from left to right. So we had a $2 billion in export impact on exports, around 1% on the depreciation of our currency, and not that relevant impacts on our inflation and on our GDP. Then second scenario was the new tariffs that were imposed. Then you had, on the third scenario, exemptions that were announced, which were these, the previous chart of the red dotted. And the fourth scenario would be the current situation with the sectors that were impacted being redirected to other markets, which would mitigate. So we see our current, what the Bradesco outlook is, somewhere between 3 and 4, where that blue arrow is, where the depreciation of the currency has to be no more than 4%, somewhere between 1.7 and 4%. This is it's just like an exercise in which how much does our currency has to depreciate so that other sectors can become as competitive and offset the impact of the tariffs. And when you come to the impact on our inflation and on our GDP, notice how it's very slight. So it's 0.2, 20 bips on inflation, not more than 20 bips, and a reduction in our growth in not more than 30 bips on the GDP. So it's not relevant once again. So, not for a different reason, our currency has been holding up pretty well lately. So this is the BRL against the dollar index at the XY. As many of you may know, the DXY is a basket of currency composed mostly of the euro, almost 60% of euro, and then yen, British pound, Canadian dollar, Swedish krona, and Swiss franc. So it's a basket of currency. So we set up this back to January 24 for both curves to start at the same point, and how the BRL reacted against the dollar index. So you'd see the volatility curves are pretty much the same. Obviously, the BRL devalued a little bit more than the devaluation of the dollar. But this is to say that despite all the noise, our currency held pretty well there. This chart gives an idea of the real interest rates. RER stands for real interest rates, and it's we got our currency and we adjusted it back to the 80s, and to get real interest rates. So you take out the Brazilian inflation, and then you put in the U.S. CPI. So then you have the real exchange rate. And what you see is a currency that, for instance, observe on the beginning, on 2002, when was the first election of Lula, when our currency was that was the worst performance of our currency, if any Brazilian can remember. It reached 4. The dollar to real ratio was 4. And today, with the U.S. inflation there, this would be 8. So that peak was never. We never got to that peak. Currently, we are in the 540, 530 range, which is even less than the worst case of the pandemic fear that happened around 2020. So once again, in terms of real exchange rate, we're we're doing pretty well. The other lines are a 5-year moving average and a 10-year moving average, and the straight line is the average for since 1980. So, and this last chart I brought to you guys is gives an idea of how Brazil holds well during the crisis. So, if you look at the first line, you have the real from 1981 to 2024. How was the Brazil GDP against the global GDP and the difference? On the middle line, during crisis years, we do really bad, and there were pretty much 10 major episodes. But on nine different non-crisis years, we did pretty well in terms of how our performance against the global GDP. So it's almost a 20 bips difference. So if we didn't have, for instance, on 1981 to 1983, which was the Brazilian moratorium, in 1980s and the late 80s and 90s, all the different stabilization plans, 1999, the big devaluation of the BRL, and on 2015, 2016, the car wash scandal. If it weren't these big crises, so we do pretty well. So, so in terms of impact to the U.S. Trade policy on global growth, this actually the impact of the tariffs could be really meaningful. So if global growth slows, Brazil will likely be affected very bad. We generally say in Brazil, if the U.S. catches a cold, we will catch pneumonia. So that said, so aside from this extreme 50% tariff scenario, Brazil could actually be an interesting play. We see that with a relatively low exposure to the U.S. and stronger links to other markets. And the large market that we have, Brazil may attract growing interest from countries and companies looking to diversify risks from not being so concentrated in the U.S. market. A clear example of this is how all the Chinese OEMs, automakers, are present in Brazil. So if you go to Brazil, you will get impressed of the amount of Chinese electric cars that are on the streets. Brands like BYD, which is supposed to be build your dreams, but Brazilians say is bring your dollars. GWM, Chery, ONJ, GAC Motors. These are cars that became a part of our day-to-day life in Brazil. And of course, all these risks that were very much well explored on the previous panels. Brazil has a lot of idiosyncratic risks, budget deficits being the worst one of them, political uncertainties, that all leading to a very rough political electoral cycle next year. So this is precisely Brazil's importance as a market that explains U.S. dialing down recently, with Trump saying recently that all the good chemistry that with Lula. Probably it's a bit of this, that how Brazil isn't that exposed, and so these are my initial remarks, and I would like to start a conversation here with my colleagues, and I think a good way to start and to level down everyone on what has happened recently. I'm going to ask Dave here on my side. With all these various tariff announcements and threats from Trump and administration, it can be hard to keep track. Would you please provide us an overview of the tariffs in place and under consideration?
So over the years, in the past, the Congress has authorized the president to impose duties or tariffs under certain limited circumstances. But the Trump administration came into the second term preloaded, ready to go with a plan to really maximize the use of those statutes and to apply them in ways that nobody ever considered possible or dreamed of doing before. And their actions sort of fall into two general buckets, I would say. The first is under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of declaring emergencies. So Trump has declared a number of emergencies relating to fentanyl, trade deficits, et cetera, and used that as a basis for imposing tariffs. The second thing they've been doing is to use national security concerns as a basis to impose duties on particular sectors of the economy. So the first bucket of duties in the press people are referring to as IEEPA duties typically. The second bucket people will refer to as Section 232 duties or sectoral duties. The first bucket was super attractive when they came into office because they wanted to, as I say, move very quickly. And under those statutes, the ones that apply to IEEPA, there's really no process that's attached to imposing duties. The president makes a decision, he signs an order, the tariffs get imposed. The second bucket moves slower, so it's been less attractive to Trump, and it has received less press. But the Section 232 investigations and Section 301 investigations, some of them have already resulted in tariffs, but others are ongoing and will result in tariffs. And I think to some extent the latter group has not been as much on people's radar screens as they should be. So what does all this mean with respect to Brazil? You have basically four buckets currently of duties that I would point out. So we have the IEEPA duties. There's something called the baseline, which is the 10% that Brazil currently faces. That applies to every country in the world. For most countries, you have a second tier to the IEEPA duties, which is called the reciprocal tariffs. Brazil was given a zero reciprocal tariff at this point because, generally speaking, the trade balance between the United States and Brazil is quite strong, as Eduardo pointed out on his slides. That could change. You have a different sort of IEEPA duty with a different emergency being declared by the president with respect to different political issues in Brazil. And that emergency was the basis for the 40% tariff, which applies to Brazil at this point. So between the 10% baseline, the 40% second IEEPA tariff, you get to 50% right now for Brazil. But importantly, you also have the Section 232 tariffs of 50% that apply to the steel and the aluminum sectors at this point. And both of those sectors for Brazil are big sources of trade surpluses. I can tell you from the clients that we work with in Brazil that many of the steel and aluminum producers have essentially put exports on hold, or they've substantially limited or reduced them. It's possible at some point that the duties will be offset by substantial price increases in the United States that will allow them to finance those additional tariffs, but at this point that's not the case. So in certain sectors, the tariffs are having a really substantial impact. The other point that I wanted to mention are the Section 301 duties that may go into effect for Brazil. So in July, the president initiated what's called a Section 301 tariff investigation to study various practices or policies of the government of Brazil that he claims are unfair in terms of their impact on U.S. exports. And there are a wide variety of allegations that were included in that investigation relating to intellectual property violations, preferential duties given to other countries, impediments to digital services, illegal deforestation. So that investigation is ongoing. People submitted written comments. In September, I believe, there was a hearing. So at this point, the administration is in the process of considering what, if anything, they'll do as a result of the Section 301 investigation. But it's possible that additional duties will be imposed. The president seems to like increments of 25 percentage points, so it could be 50, it could be 75, it could be 100. We really don't know. But we think that that will be announced in the springtime. So we'll have to wait and see there. The key point, I think, about the Section 301 duties is when Trump has imposed these sorts of duties in the past, particularly with respect to China, they've been additive in the sense that they go on top of Section 232 duties, they go on top of IEPA duties, et cetera. So the terminology that you'll see in the press sometimes is stacking. So if Section 301 tariffs were imposed, we expect that they would probably stack on tops of other tariffs that already exist with respect to Brazil. So you can see that, incrementally, things could look a lot worse in the future. We don't know, but it's a risk that should be on people's radar screens.
Interesting. Yeah, and hearing about you talking about the sectors which Brazil really does well, steel, agriculture, aluminum, that's really worrying. And on this topic, I want to ask Bruna, these are competitive sectors we have, steel, aluminum, agriculture. Given this scenario, what are the real options for response, both diplomatically and from the private sector? And is there room for short-term negotiations?
Well, thank you for the question. And thank you, David, for your remarks and for reminding us of sometimes the obvious that we forget about what we are going through in these 9 months. Well, I think we have to understand that the current crisis is unfolding in a moment where we have very little, very distorted perceptions and very limited engagement between Brazil and the United States at the government-to-government level. Second is, I think we have to always remember that the center of gravity of these negotiations between Brazil and the U.S. lies in politics, not in economics. And the tariff issue is less about trade and more about other issues, political, geopolitical issues. So any deal made moving forward will need to be framed so that Washington and Brasilia can claim victory. I normally look at this, what we are going through, and obviously there's a lot that has been said this morning, and I've learned a lot. So I will try to add a little nuance to what's been said and not repeat myself. But I always look at this crisis in 3 layers. One is obviously the geopolitical vortex, the political vortex of it. And the window of opportunity, I think, for that has been opened after the meeting between President Trump and President Lula at the UN General Assembly. Then there is the second layer, which is the damage control layer. And the damage control layer is the layer that we see unfolding with the private sector engaging with both the government here, but most importantly with the economic sectors that have interest in the United States. And then third, I think we have the opportunities. And then I see many opportunities for us to rethink the relationship starting on day 1 of the new administration in Brazil after the election in 2026. So, but then one of the things I'd like to add to that is I think to the brief opening in the short-term solution of this crisis. As I said, the center of gravity of this is political. So I think the presidential conversation could reset talks and reduce tensions if kept focused on trade and not in politics. I think the unpredictability and how personal the relationship with any relationship with the president of the United States has the risk of politicizing the discussion. Another variable I would add here, and I often say that, a lot of people who cared a lot about the importance of Brazil-U.S. relations in the hemisphere are no longer in the U.S. administration, in Washington, in the executive branch. So we see a lot of those people just retired, moved on, or are no longer in the administration for other reasons. So I think there is a lack of understanding and goodwill, as I said. And we have to fill this vacuum with information. So I think, as I said before, if there is any short-term solution, it will emerge from the top level of this conversation, and it will also be have to be a win-win solution that be framed in a way that both Washington and Brasilia can claim victory. Brazil has opportunities to negotiate reduction of like tariffs, expanding the exception list. I think there are concessions to be made. There are possibilities of concessions on ethanol, possibilities of progress on intellectual property reform, possible cooperation on critical minerals. We all know how central to the United States it is, especially if the United States demonstrates interest in investing in processing critical minerals in Brazil. There are broader trade concessions that Brazil could make. But at the same time, I think the private sector here in Washington has become Brazil's most credible diplomatic channel. I think it also needs to think the long term and not only crisis management mode. I think it is important to frame arguments in U.S. terms, showing how tariffs can hurt U.S. manufacturers, who are relying on Brazilian inputs. I think there is opportunity to, as I said, to reframe the agenda. Just 7 U.S. states, Texas, California, Kentucky, Illinois, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, and Florida account for more than 60% of all U.S.-Brazil trade. And I think with that, you can have a real map of interdependence between both countries and create stories about it. You have states that are really important in the energy sector, with billions in exports of fuels, plastics, chemicals. You have the aerospace corridor with Kentucky, with Florida, Georgia. Then you have a more industrial belt where you have other states like Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, which are exactly important states for the 2026 midterm elections. And you have also, obviously, the way how our bioinputs for fertilizers and agriculture connects with other sectors. We have Arkansas, for example, where Suzano, a Brazilian company, has made investments and have had a great success in advocating for exceptions of tariffs. So I think beyond the trade ledger, we have to create a narrative of interdependence between both countries, where we can find understanding who gains and loses in this relationship. I think it's really important. And also understanding where the nodes where geoeconomics meets domestic politics, so that the private sector can have a more straightforward and strategic agenda in Washington that goes beyond solving the short-term crisis and goes beyond only having a lobby firm that opens a door for a meeting, but makes Brazil part of the ongoing conversation in Washington.
Thanks. That's very interesting. And you mentioned the importance that geopolitical risks plays on that. And I want to explore with you a little more what this risk is today. What are we describing here? And how is it changing the rules of global trade?
Yeah. Well, I think geopolitical risk today really captures the persistent tension, conflict, and competition among major powers. I think we see more and more geopolitical risk being assessed in different ways. One of the ways I do observe and see how it's being measured is through the model that was created by two professors, Caldara and Iacoviello, and they created an index that shows how geopolitical risks has spiked in 2022 following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and has been reaching the highest level in more than 2 decades. And I think this demonstrates how much other elements in the competition between China and the United States have brought to the table different variables for boardrooms to assess moving forward. One is also the fact that for the first time in 2023, the world experienced almost 60 state-based armed conflicts. So we see war-related components of the geopolitical risk being more and more captured in having effects in global trade. I also dare to say that, in other words, that these days the geopolitical risk is some sort of hidden tariff of our time. There is an estimate of the World Bank that shows that spikes on geopolitical risk index is associated with a decline in trade of 30 to 40%. And that means it's the equivalent of a tariff effect estimated between 8 and 14%. And it demonstrates how inward a country can become, as you were talking about Brazil's data and so on and so forth, and why Brazil is so resilient in front of all those shocks because of that. I think the real question is how countries that are outside of the sphere of influence that don't want to be caught in fighting for the sphere of influence of China in the United States will navigate that. You mentioned a couple options like reshaping supply chains, countries prioritizing resilience over efficiency sometimes through reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, you name the shoring you want. But I think that the key question is also how the boardrooms are weighing those geopolitical risks and making decisions on whether or not to cater supply chains for one bloc or the other, or to its internal market. So I think that's one important question for us to ask. The other is obviously how we are going to diversify and build resilience through trade agreements, and how we are going to maximize those trade agreements in order to achieve that. On top of that, we see that the modern definition of geopolitical risk, and more I see that, it's encompassing more than the obviously armed conflicts, but it's including pandemics as we live through, biological threats, cyber attacks, climate shocks, and extreme weather events. So those are, I think, variables that are being taken into consideration and expanding the definition of geopolitical risks more recently. But definitely, I'd say that more and more the economists are calling the geopolitical risk experts to understand what is at stake, and I think Brazil should be more and more prepared for that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and one of the things that is most important when you speak of geopolitical risks is oil, which is always under. It's been a cause of many wars in the past, and so with this, I want to ask here my good friend Roberto, and also he's my colleague at the board of directors of Bratec. Roberto, how does energy fit in the agenda between Brazil and U.S., and how was this market affected by the recent rise in the tariffs?
It's very important. You one of the slides you show mentioned that oil is simply the largest product in terms of trade between Brazil and U.S. We export on a daily basis to this country 200,000 barrels of oil. And we also are importing a reasonable amount of natural gas, liquefying natural gas, because Brazil, we have a system in which if you have a dry season or something around the power generation coming from hydro, the backup system we have in the country is natural gas. So we have 7 liquefaction plants spread around the country, and those plants we use liquefying natural gas, mainly coming from U.S. So the trade between Brazil and U.S. in this market it's very important, is very relevant. Brazil is becoming more and more important in terms of producing oil. Today, as I mentioned, we have a production of 5 million barrels of oil per day. This is a huge case of success in Brazil because, as you remember, the ones that are older than me, in the 70s, when we have the famous oil shock 71, 72, at that time Brazil imported 90% of its oil. It was a big issue for the country, a big geopolitical issue. We have to look for oil in Middle East in a very urgent basis. All the country and all the government was focused on that. That's why we developed this ethanol policy. At that time, the famous pro-alcohol was nothing related to environmental. It's just energy security. And but with the research we have done in Brazil, with a lot of work from companies like Petrobras, and then later other foreign companies that came to Brazil, we managed to steadily increasing the production of oil, and today Brazil is in a very stable and very comfortable position that last year oil was simply the first product of our trade balance. Yeah? We have surpassed the soybean and other agricultural products in terms of importance in the trade balance. So this is a good result. Of course, we have to address this in a more comprehensive way because of those discussions about global warming, sustainability, and so we are applying a lot of technology to reduce the amount of CO2 per barrel produced. And Brazil today, because of this technology, we are able to produce a barrel of oil that is the second lowest carbon emission barrel in the world. So this is very important because when we see the world progressing in terms of demanding energy, but energy that is needs to be low carbon, Brazil is going to take a leadership, I'm sure, about this in the future. And I think that the market here in U.S. is very important. U.S. is, of course, have increased its oil and gas production over the last decades. Today, United States produce around 17 million barrels of oil equivalent, but consumes 21. So there is still a gap, and we are able to provide some of this oil to fill this gap. And that's not by coincidence that oil was exempted. Oil and oil byproducts were exempted from those horrible tariff war that we have between Brazil and the U.S. right now.
Thank you, Roberto. I want to shift gears here and ask David regarding China. I showed on my, I think it was the first slide, how important China is for Brazil in terms of exports, 30% of our total output of exports. And how do you think this trade relationship between Brazil and United States can play out during this tariff crisis?
Well, I mean, I think one of the factors when I speak to clients in Brazil that I think Brazilian corporates tend to not understand or to underestimate is the hostility of the U.S. government towards Brazil, the government of Brazil, because of its relationship with China and also, to a lesser extent, maybe Russia. I think it started with the Biden administration, but for sure it's become much higher, more critical factor in the Trump administration. I think it begins with the observation that someone made this morning that Trump is keen to preserve the role of the dollar in international settlements, et cetera. He's very worried about the BRIC countries' efforts to come up with some other sort of currency solution to make the dollar less important, which generates hostility. If you talk to people within the Trump administration's trade policy team, completely illogically, they feel that the ability of Brazil to step in and fill Chinese soybean demand is somehow illegitimate or disloyal or something like this. So, but without defending these positions, I think it's important to understand them. And I think that Brazil is going to be stuck in a position where I don't know that it can advance its relationships, the diversification with China, and at the same time try to move forward in its relationship on trade issues with the United States. I think probably for the foreseeable future, it's naive to think that that's going to be possible.
Yeah, so that leaves us very little action, little possibility to revert this. And I want to also ask you that the Trump tariffs are being reviewed by the Supreme Court. So how will that case affect exports in Brazil? And if that's the case, if that case is successful, what happens next?
Well, a couple things. First, I think it's important at a very high level to understand that the Trump administration needs tariffs, right? I mean, they've come into the second term, a large part of their platform related to tariff protection. They need it politically. I don't think that they can walk away from it. They've also, through the One Big Beautiful Bill, given very large tax breaks or maintained tax breaks that have a big fiscal impact on the United States. The only way that they can try to fill that gap and keep many of the Republican members of Congress in line is through the prospect of increased revenue through tariff collection. So I think the starting point needs to be that they're going to do whatever they need to do to try to keep tariffs of one sort or another in place for the next 3 years. The Supreme Court case that you mentioned relates only to a few of the tariffs that I mentioned this morning. It relates specifically to the IEEPA tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China in relation to an emergency of fentanyl imports and also trade imbalances. It's possible, I think most people put the chances at around 50-50 that the Supreme Court will decide that those tariffs are illegal. If it does, that precedent would indirectly have important implications for people that wanted to challenge the IEEPA tariffs with respect to Brazil. But that victory would have absolutely no impact whatsoever on the Section 232 and the Section 301 duties that I mentioned earlier. So what we expect to see happen, and it's already happening with the various Section 232 investigations that are going on, is increased reliance on those sorts of investigations where there's very little chance that the tariffs would be overruled by the Supreme Court. So if we do get to the point in the spring that the Supreme Court says the existing IEEPA tariffs are illegal, they're going to be able to switch gears very quickly and replace those tariffs with Section 230 tariffs that won't really be challengeable.
Yeah, that's interesting, yeah. And you mentioned the One Big Beautiful Bill Act from Trump, and one of the things he did was end the incentives of electrical cars, and this reminds me of renewable energy, which is something that is really a big topic right now. And I want to ask Roberto that Brazil is facing some challenges on renewables like the U.S. is. Any lessons to learn at this point?
Yes. the renewable market in Brazil, it's amazing. Just to give you an idea, 89% of the power generation in Brazil comes from renewable sources. 89%. And in some of the months of last year, we reached 90% of the power generation in the country coming from renewable sources. Basically, hydro, that is very traditional, because we have big rivers, big dams, but also very important, the solar source, the wind source, and the biomass source. So when those four are combined, the energy matrix in Brazil is one of the cleanest in the world. And but we have issues in the country, and the issue is long-term planning. Why I'm saying that? Because energy, power is a molecule. You have to transport the molecule, and you need distribution lines. You need a network, a grid, in which you can have this energy produced in some place in the country, but consuming in other places of the country. We have a good grid that was developed by Brazil during the 50-some years ago, but still they need a lot of investment, and those investments were not made. And we do have a situation right now that we have a renewable source of energy, producing energy, solar and wind, but have no consumer. This energy is lost, especially during this some time of the day. And connecting this debate with the United States, there is one issue that is important, that is, I think it is going to be part of this next round of negotiation. It's ethanol. This country is the largest producer of ethanol in the world. Ethanol coming from corn. Brazil, 70% of our ethanol is produced by sugarcane, very traditional. You remember the Portuguese, they occupy Brazil for producing sugar, using sugarcane industry. They developed this industry, and we switch the plants from sugar to ethanol, but it's a very long 500 years industry we have in the country, and traditionally located in the north part of Brazil, northeast. So talking about the state of Pernambuco, Alagoas, and this particular part of the ethanol production industry in Brazil, they lack efficiency. They produce ethanol. It's traditional, but they are not as productive as the industry in São Paulo, Mato Grosso, that is much more using of equipment. The land is flat, so you can use different machines for harvesting and planting, etc. that you cannot use in that part of the country. And there is a big complaint from the United States that we imposed some tariffs. So it's one of the few cases in which Brazil really put a very high tariffs on imported ethanol from the U.S. And I'm sure that this issue is going to be part of the discussions, and this will create some issues for the local producers, especially in Pernambuco and Alagoas, because there is an understanding that they cannot compete with ethanol coming from the U.S., and they are going to face a lot of difficulties. So let's see.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the gap between that can, as incredible as it may seem, the excess production can cause problems. So if you don't have a good distribution grid ready to distribute that energy, that can cause a problem. I heard that has caused blackouts in Brazil a few years ago. Last night we had a blackout in Brazil in a few states. I don't know. I read this morning. I don't know what was the cause of it, but we're going to see what happens in the next few days, but the reasons for it. But that's certainly a big challenge, being able to distribute all that energy, the solar, the wind, the hydro, and you have the oil, you have the gas, so that makes up to a big grid in Brazil, which is it is supposed to be pretty reliable, but hasn't proven to be so. And regarding this renewable deployment versus rising energy security, because this is what we're talking here, a reliable source of energy. Any concerns amid all these geopolitical tensions?
Yes, I think so. If you take this in a more long term, because when you have an energy, what is important for energy source? The energy source has to be available, reliable, and competitive in terms of price. And if you can also include the sustainable, even better. Yeah. The solar and the wind, they are sustainable, they are competitive, they are available, but they are not reliable, because depending on the time of the day, you have the solar, of course, 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the PM, the solar source goes out, and then you start to create. The same thing happened with the wind. Those that are familiar with the industry, they know that there are some hours of the day that, depending on the region of the country, you have those changed in the generation, and that creates a lot of issues for Brazil, because the issue of balancing all this system to have a more efficient distribution of those sources of energy, but without having the risk of having a kind of blackout. That is the big issue. And then we are now discussing, for instance, connecting our grid with Argentina, importing gas from Argentina, Vaca Muerta project in Neuquén. That is very important. Argentina has the second largest shale reserve in the world after the United States. It's a huge reserve of gas they have in the north part of the country, in Neuquén province, and we can easily use this in Brazil as a backup system. So this will create more stability to our system, and will lower the risk of any kind of blackout.
Got it. Before opening to Q&A, let me ask a last question to Bruna. Still on this point of the renewables, but looking a little beyond this current crisis, where do you see the most promising opportunities to deepen the Brazil-U.S. relationship in areas such as energy, green transition, technologies or services? And if I can follow up on that, what would a healthy and sustainable new balance of Brazil-U.S. trade relation look like moving forward?
Okay, so I think many of the issues have already been said. So I think sustainable agriculture and energy is obviously one point. In the agriculture space, obviously we are competitors, but there is opportunity for, as I said before, bio-inputs. And then you have all the avenue around biodiesel and biofuels, sustainable aviation fuels, especially with the demand being driven with the U.S. And Europe, obviously. But Brazil has the feedstock for that. As I mentioned, I think rare earths and critical minerals have tremendous opportunities. Again, investment in processing these critical minerals is where there is the advantage for the United States. Very often we see that last year we saw DFC's presence and investment on a critical minerals project, but very often we see some of those focus has been only on avoiding the access of China to those raw materials instead of understanding how Brazil might play a role in those critical supply chains. So I know it's very hard, but it's very important, I think, for the future of Brazil-U.S. relations, for us to look beyond the C word, China, as a central element here. I always remind people 78% of the world population lives outside the US and China, and Brazil is an important bridge with the rest of this world. So if we don't move beyond that, we might get stuck and lose a lot of the opportunities that we have for this important bilateral relationship. I think, as I said before, I think there are so many interdependent sectors, and especially in the intra-company trade, that we see so much of interdependence between both countries, that those stories need to be told. There is a lot of opportunity, and some of those have been mentioned here before, especially in the opening remarks when Ambassador mentioned the opportunities for fintech, for the financial sector. I would add to that the digital infrastructure economy and digital economy space for that. I think Brazil needs and can bring a little more regulatory pluralism to the world in that space, given that we are seeing a fragmentation occurring between the spaces dominated by China, by the United States, and also by the European Union. When it comes to artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. I think another key U.S. demand for improved IP protection, reduction of the backlog in patent approval, all that is important for both countries to find viable space for mutually agreeable commitments. But now looking at the new balance for the next 5 years, I think we need sustained engagement. And by sustained engagement, I mean beyond the non-governmental actors. There's so many of members of the private sector who blame the lack of engagement by the government here in Washington, but honestly, the dialogue must be sustained by civil society, by the private sector, and by the policy communities in order to ensure that we have economic dividends that will generate sufficient capital for the political field to catch up eventually, because those political wins will come and go, and we are both countries living in a very, very polarized space. So unless you have the economic dividends in place so that you can generate enough capital to later on build a relationship in either 1 year or even 5 years, and even start rethinking on agreements and more structured modes of engagement, I think we are not going to advance on that. And finally, I think with daring to be a little more philosophical towards the end of this panel, I always say, like, Brazil and the United States have to prove the world that democracies can deliver at scale. And I think that is a topic that has to come back to the center of the bilateral relation. Brazil today, if you look at where are the largest infrastructure projects in the world in the 21st century, they are all in non-democratic countries. It's still like Brazil lacks, for example, of more than 50% of the Brazilian population still don't have access to sewage treatment. The United States has been falling behind when it comes to investments in infrastructure for railroads, for example. At the same time, in the same time span, you see China building much faster and better than the United States. So I think both countries have to prove the world that they can solve their problems in a civilized manner, but also prove the world that democracies can deliver goods at scale. And that's something I think is the challenge of our generation, and that's where I think it's where I see the future of this relationship being too important to fail.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't agree more regarding the strength of our democracy. We can't never forget that we impeached the president back in the 90s. A major investigation in Brazil put a president behind bars. Well, now he's back in office, but things happen, and but it's all legal, all under a Supreme Court ruling, and so everything is clear and transparent for the population. So yeah, we have to respect that, and I think that the world, especially all other nations that have dictatorial regimes, have a lot to learn about that. Yeah, so we're coming to an end here. I think we have time for no more than three questions. If anyone has a question, I don't know where the mics are, but you're free to ask. Yeah, on the back there.
Good morning. Thank you very much to the panel. Fred Kulo, strategic consultant. When we talk about especially the United States and Brazil's energy systems, the technology and the build-out of China's energy sector is a real opportunity to mitigate some of the direct risks that were just talked about on this panel. And yet there's an irony that this panel has also painted, that the more Brazil leans on China as a way to mitigate the risks from the United States, or the more the political tensions become strained between the two nations. So we've talked about this a little bit, but how does Brazil position itself as both a model for the United States' infrastructure and energy security issues, while also not creating more political problems by importing technologies such as battery powers, or being more of a conduit for Chinese business and exports to China, as we've discussed, presents a political risk?
Thank you, Fred. Bruno, I think that has a lot to do with what you just discussed on the last question. Can you take that one?
Yeah, I can, but I'm not an energy expert, so I defer to my colleagues when it comes to technology. I think it goes back to the lack of understanding of both countries, the lack of understanding of each other in terms of both countries. A lot of my time in DC is explaining Brazil's non-alignment and how much Brazil is trying to, at the same time, to avoid being caught in the fight between the United States and China, and explaining why Brazil has chosen that path, and explaining, again, not agreeing or disagreeing, but just showing the facts that there are opportunities for the United States in Brazil for those investments. But in order to, I think, take advantage of that, one important message that Brazilians leave to the U.S. Business sector is show up. Like, show up for investments, show up to engage with Brazil. So I think there is always this both sides demanding more from each other, but very little like continuing engagement. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think I think for Brazil, it's hard to make choices, obviously. And pushing for that will only guarantee that Brazil is leaning more and more towards China infrastructure and China investment on those critical sectors. So again, unless you move beyond that and focus on other results and what's good for Brazilians and good for Americans, I don't think we're going to get to an end of this discussions. But one thing I often listen and I often hear from Brazilians is, yeah, we would welcome the American investments and not closing deals with the Chinese on a number of infrastructure projects if the Americans showed up for that. We always hear that, and whenever we bring that up, we always have the same eyebrows raising and saying all the challenges and concerns and threats that the Chinese infrastructure represents. So I think countries like Brazil, they are learning how to navigate that. And I don't think pushing for countries to pick sides will help in any way, as we are all trying to hedge bets and navigate a very, very risky environment. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think there is the need for more mutual understanding of the reasons behind all that.
Roberto, as an energy expert, anything to add?
No, basically, I agree with Bruna, and just two quick comments. First, the more U.S. press Brazil on tariffs, the more we'll try to find a place for, or at least for our oil. And this is happening also with the soybean, with the beef and other. We have seen, I think 2 or 3 days ago, a big article in the Valor Econômico, it's the most important paper in Brazil, in the economic area, mentioning that many areas in Brazil are managing to find on other markets for the product that were originally shipped to the United States, and this is not going to be different in terms of the oil. Not just talking about the commodity itself, the oil, but also other things that are more interesting from the American point of view, like the big structures that we imported from abroad to produce oil in Brazil, because our oil, especially the pre-salt, the so-called pre-salt, that is ultra-deep waters located offshore Rio and São Paulo, we need big kind of ships. We call FPSOs, floating production, storage, and offloading units. Those are ships with the size of 3 soccer fields. It's a huge unit. They cost around $2.5 billion each unit. And this is a lot of equipment, a lot of technology. Some of this technology is coming traditionally from the United States, from United States companies. Houston and Texas area are the natural suppliers. But if there is some issues with the tariffs and these products are going to be expensive, of course that we'll try to find those equipment from other sources. This is, I think, it is reasonable. So there is a danger also in this kind of policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah. So I want to thank the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce for having invited me. I want to thank panelists, Dave, Roberto, Bruna, for such an interesting panel. And I hope you guys have a nice rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day in New York. Bye-bye.